Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The demonic nun. I had heard the whispers about the old church on the outskirts of Raleigh. People spoke of it with a strange reverence, as though it were more than just a place of worship. As I drove past it, I couldn't help but feel drawn to its dark silhouette against the fading sky. It stood alone, far from any other building, surrounded by trees that looked like gnarled fingers reaching towards the heavens. The tall, crumbling spires pierced the sky like broken teeth, their faded stone walls telling stories of forgotten times. The church was old, far older than any I had ever encountered. The wood of the doors was warped, as though it had been exposed to centuries of rain and wind. The windows, once grand and clear, were now dust-covered and cracked, allowing slivers of light to spill into the interior like the faintest of ghosts. It seemed almost as though the church was decaying from the inside out. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the ground around it was overgrown with weeds, creeping up against the stone like nature was trying to reclaim it. Yet, despite the obvious neglect, there was something undeniably captivating about the place. The church wasn't abandoned, it was open, the door ajar, as though it were waiting for someone to enter. No one had been here for years, and yet it felt like it had been preserved for this moment. The few people in town who still remembered the church's past avoided it, muttering about strange happenings and cursed grounds. But I wasn't like them. I was here to investigate, to experience the history for myself. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping inside. A chill brushed my skin, and the shadows inside seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The light from outside barely illuminated the interior, leaving the corners bathed in an oppressive darkness. The air was heavy with an eerie stillness that made me pause for a moment. I had expected dust, cobwebs, and the usual markers of neglect, but the inside was strangely well preserved. The pews, though cracked and worn, were neatly arranged as if they had been untouched for years. A faint scent of incense clung to the air, though there was no sign of anything burning. As I walked further into the church, I felt an odd sensation of being watched, a prickle at the back of my neck, but I quickly brushed it off as the effect of my own imagination. After all, it was just a church, a place of history, nothing more. Still, the overwhelming sense of abandonment, mixed with the strange beauty of the place, made me uneasy. It was as though this church was frozen in time, untouched by the modern world yet not entirely lifeless. The silence in the room felt like a weight pressing down on me. I tried to shake off the unease, but the shadows seemed to close in around me, and the strange feeling only grew. I stood there, in the middle of the empty space, my breath slow and deliberate, yet I couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. Still, I couldn't turn away. There was something irresistibly magnetic about the place, something that whispered to me, pulling me deeper into its mystery. As I made my way toward the altar, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears, a faint bell tolling in the distance. I froze, wondering where it was coming from, but there was no one else in sight. No one but me, standing in the heart of the church, surrounded by its ancient stones. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows, but no one appeared. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. After all, it was just a bell. Just a relic of the past. Yet, as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. And so, I stayed, my curiosity overpowering my unease. The church seemed to welcome me, despite its eerie silence and the faint sense of dread that lingered in the air. It felt as though this was a place suspended between worlds, as though it held secrets that had never been meant for anyone to uncover. As I turned to leave, I heard it again, the bell tolling, distant but clear, as though calling me back. The sound of the bell was soft at first, barely noticeable, like a whisper on the wind. I had just stepped away from the altar when it tolled again. This time, the deep, resonant chime filled the air, its low echo vibrating through the walls of the church. I froze. The bell rang slowly, methodically, as though someone was standing at the rope, pulling it with deliberate intent. But there was no one in sight. I looked around the dimly lit church, my eyes scanning the shadows. I could see no movement, no sign of life. The bell's toll reverberated through the heavy air, filling the space with a hollow sound that seemed to linger longer than it should. It was a peculiar feeling, like the bell was calling to me, but I couldn't understand why. I glanced up at the tower, where the bell hung, swaying ever so slightly. There was no one up there, no sign of anyone near the ropes. It was strange, but my first thought was simple, an old mechanism, perhaps, that had become unstable over time, ringing of its own accord. Maybe the bell tower was simply malfunctioning, some old machinery misfiring in the dead of night. I shook my head, trying to push away the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. It made sense. The church was ancient. Things broke down. The bell could have been rigged up to ring every so often, the rope still swinging from some forgotten action long ago. There was no need to jump to conclusions. Yet, as I moved closer to the entrance, I noticed something unsettling. The bell rang with a peculiar regularity, each chime coming precisely 1 minute apart. The sound was too precise, too deliberate for any broken mechanism. I glanced at my watch. It was 11:55 p.m. 5 minutes until midnight. I couldn't help but feel a strange pull, an unexplainable desire to stay, to see what would happen next. The bell continued, tolling without interruption, each ring growing more profound, as though it were summoning something or someone. I made my way to the back of the church, my curiosity tugging at me. I wanted to know more, to understand why the bell rang so regularly. But as I walked deeper into the church, the sound of the bell seemed to grow louder, even though I wasn't any closer to the bell tower. It was almost as if the sound was coming from all around me, as if it were echoing in my head. The air felt colder now, thick with an unnatural chill. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, and for the first time since I had entered, I began to feel truly uncomfortable. It was as if the space had changed, as if the church itself was shifting, bending under the weight of something unseen. I glanced at the clock again. 11:58 p.m. 2 more minutes. The anticipation in the air was palpable, heavy with a strange sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the bell rang again, each toll marking the passage of time. And then, as the clock struck midnight, the bell rang louder than before, its sound shaking the very foundations of the church. But something was different now. It wasn't just the bell ringing anymore. There was a deeper resonance in the sound, something almost alive. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It felt intentional. My heart began to race. The chimes faded away, leaving only the echo of the final toll. The church was silent once more, but the feeling of something lurking in the shadows remained. I turned toward the door, feeling the pull of the outside world, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was something here, something about the bell, something about the church that refused to let me go. I had to know why it rang. The question gnawed at me, pulling me back toward the altar, toward the heart of the mystery. The bell, I realized, wasn't ringing by accident. It wasn't just some malfunction. It was calling, and I had no choice but to answer. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had spent the rest of the night thinking about the bell, its eerie tolling, and the strange atmosphere inside the church. I tried to convince myself it was just an old building, some forgotten relic with a faulty bell tower. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. There was something more to it. Something I couldn't explain. I decided to find out more. The town of Raleigh wasn't big, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. I figured I could ask around, talk to some of the older locals. Surely someone could shed light on the history of that church, something to explain the strange events I'd experienced. I headed to the small diner in the center of town, a place where the regulars gathered for coffee and gossip. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, and the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee immediately greeted me. It was quiet, with only a handful of people sitting at the counter, sipping their drinks and chatting softly. I took a seat at the far end of the counter and ordered a coffee, trying to look casual, like I wasn't already planning to ask about the church. The waitress, a woman in her mid-50s with a kind face, poured me a cup and asked, "What brings you into town?" "I was just exploring a bit," I said, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "There's this old church on the outskirts, near the woods. I passed by it last night, and I was curious. Ever heard of it?" Her expression changed almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. It was a subtle shift, like someone closing off a part of their mind they didn't want to revisit. "The church?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were speaking about something forbidden. "You best stay away from there, son. That place, it's not what you think it is." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the shift in her demeanor. "Why? It's just a church, isn't it?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the diner, making sure no one was paying too much attention. Then she leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice. "People don't talk about it much," she began, her words measured and cautious. "But there's been talk for years, for as long as I can remember. Strange things, unexplainable things. That church is different. People say it's cursed, that it's haunted. There's always been something off about it." I chuckled lightly, not sure what to make of her warning. "Cursed? Haunted? It's just an old building. What, do you think it's some kind of ghost story?" She didn't smile, didn't even flinch at my skepticism. "It's not a ghost story, son. There's something much worse than that. People have disappeared near that church, you know. Been found out in the woods, half crazed, saying they heard voices calling them in the night. Others said they felt something watching them from the windows, but when they looked, there was no one there." She paused, as if letting the weight of her words settle. I tried to laugh it off, but the uneasy feeling from the night before came rushing back. "You're serious, aren't you?" She nodded slowly. "I don't know what happened there. No one does. But there's always been a strange pull to that place. They say it was built on land that was never meant to be touched. It's cursed, like I said. People around here know better than to go poking around in it." "Who's they?" I asked, my curiosity growing. She hesitated, glancing at the door before answering. "Old folks, mostly. People who've been here since before the war. They've seen things. I've heard rumors about a nun, long ago, someone who performed some kind of ritual there, one that wasn't meant for the living. But no one really knows for sure what happened. I leaned in closer, the words catching in my throat. A nun? What kind of ritual? Her gaze shifted to the window, as though she didn't want to be overheard. She wiped her hands on her apron, nervously fidgeting. I don't know all the details, but they say she tried to summon something dark. And in the end, she became part of it. People say she's still there, still haunting the church, calling out to those who dare enter. There's no peace there, not for anyone who steps foot inside. I didn't know what to make of all of this. It sounded like a story pulled straight from a horror movie, but the way she spoke, with such certainty and fear, made me second-guess my earlier dismissal. You believe all of this? I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. She met my gaze, her eyes tired but firm. I believe what I've seen and what others have seen. There's no denying it. People around here know better than to go near that place after dark. But it's up to you, of course. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. What exactly happens at night? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. The waitress shook her head, as if she were trying to convince herself more than me. The bell, mostly. It rings at midnight, every night. No one knows why, but it's always the same. And when it rings, people say it's like the church is alive, like it's calling out to you, pulling you in. Once you hear that bell, you can't help but go back. I sat back, my mind racing. I had heard it, too, the bell. And now, after hearing her words, I wasn't sure whether I had imagined the strange feeling of being watched, or whether it was something real. As I paid for my coffee and left the diner, the weight of the conversation lingered in my mind. The rumors, the warnings, they were all stacking up, and I couldn't tell if I was being drawn into something much bigger than I could understand. But one thing was certain, the bell had sounded last night, and I couldn't ignore the strange pull it had on me. I needed to go back. I needed to know the truth. That night, I couldn't stay away. Something in me, some unshakable curiosity mixed with a strange, growing sense of dread, pulled me back to the church. The stories from the diner kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. The bell, the disappearances, the nun. It was all too bizarre to ignore. I had to see it for myself, no matter what my gut was telling me. I drove back to the church, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness, illuminating the twisted trees that surrounded the building. The wind picked up, and the air felt colder than it had been earlier in the day. There was a strange stillness in the air, an oppressive silence that made every movement feel amplified. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed the church again, its looming, decaying presence. The building seemed even more foreboding in the dark, its once grand architecture now reduced to something almost otherworldly, a silhouette against the moonless sky. The door was open just a crack, as it had been the night before, waiting. I hesitated at the threshold, a wave of unease washing over me. The inside of the church was as cold and silent as I remembered, but there was something else now, something intangible, like a presence, an energy in the air that hadn't been there earlier. I moved slowly down the center aisle, past the rows of weathered pews, and made my way toward the back of the church, where I sat down on one of the benches. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and bend as if they were alive, constantly shifting. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m. I had half an hour until midnight. The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly, each one heavy with anticipation, as though the church itself were holding its breath. I tried to steady my nerves, sitting quietly in the darkness, watching the flickering candlelight from the altar cast long, erratic shadows. The stillness was suffocating, the kind of silence that made your thoughts feel louder than they should be. I focused on my breathing, trying to push away the creeping sense that something was wrong, that I was being watched. But there was no one there, just me, alone in the church. The bell tower loomed above, a silent, ominous presence. I hadn't expected to feel this uneasy, but now that I was here, I wasn't so sure. The stories, the warnings, they all seemed to be closing in on me, turning the church into a cage. 11:55 p.m. I stiffened, my eyes darting to the clock on the wall. The bell would ring soon, just as it had the night before. But this time, I was ready. I told myself I wouldn't let it spook me. It was just an old bell, part of the church's history, nothing more. Then, it happened. The bell tolled. The sound shattered the silence, vibrating through the church like a sudden jolt of electricity. It rang louder than I had remembered, its deep, resonant chimes echoing with an almost unnatural intensity. The first toll sent a shock of unease through me, making my skin prickle. It was as though the sound was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. It felt suffocating, overwhelming, as if the bell was calling not just across the church, but into my very soul. The second toll came, just as steady, just as strong. And then the third, the fourth, each one ringing with a power that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the church. I could feel the vibrations beneath my feet, feel the air growing heavier, thicker. The bell wasn't just tolling anymore, it was shaking the foundations of the church, pulling at something deep inside me. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the edge of the pew. The room felt different now, darker, as though the shadows had deepened and stretched even further. My breath quickened, my heart racing as the bell continued to toll. I glanced at the clock again. 12 o'clock a.m. The bell rang one final time, louder than the rest, a deafening chime that seemed to echo forever. And then, silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that fills your ears and presses down on you, making your own breath sound too loud, too intrusive. I stood there in the dark, frozen. The air was colder now, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my skin. I didn't want to move, didn't want to break the silence that hung so heavily around me. Something felt wrong. Not just wrong, but dangerous. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so quiet that I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, like a voice carried on the wind. It was soft, almost a murmur, but its intent was unmistakable. A voice calling my name. Come closer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper wasn't coming from any one direction, it seemed to come from all around me, filling the church, the space above me, below me, behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. The church had been still, silent, just moments ago. But now, it was alive, filled with an energy that I couldn't explain. It was as if the very walls were pulsing with something dark, something hungry. I had to get out. My body screamed at me to leave, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the air itself was holding me in place, as if the church had wrapped its fingers around me, pulling me deeper into its darkness. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, I heard another sound. A soft, hollow laugh. It was low, almost inaudible, but it was unmistakable. And it came from nowhere. From everywhere. I was no longer alone. I was no longer alone. The thought echoed in my mind as I stood frozen in the church, my eyes darting nervously across the darkened room. The whispers had stopped, but the unease hadn't. Instead, it had grown, rippling through the air like an invisible force pressing down on my chest. The silence felt thicker now, suffocating, and my mind raced as I tried to convince myself that it was all just a trick of my nerves, just shadows and old wood creaking in the night. But as I stood there, every instinct screamed at me to leave. The first sign came as a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. It vibrated through the floor, reverberating through the very walls of the church. I spun around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but there was nothing. No source. Just the echo of that unsettling noise, as though something was lurking just out of sight, watching me. I took a step back, my heart racing. My breath came in shallow, quick gasps, and the coldness in the air seemed to intensify. It wasn't just the temperature that had dropped, it was a weight, a heaviness that pressed against my lungs, making it harder to breathe. Then came the wind. A sudden gust howled through the cracks in the church's old stone walls. The windows rattled, the doors groaned as if they were being tugged at by some unseen hand. The wind howled, louder now, like a voice calling out in the night, a mournful wail that sent a chill racing down my spine. I glanced up at the broken stained glass windows, those twisted patterns of colored light and shadow, and for a split second, I swore I saw something move behind them. A dark figure, a shadow that seemed to melt in and out of view. I turned away quickly, shaking my head. My mind was playing tricks on me. There was no one there. Nothing but the wind and the old building groaning under the weight of time. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was getting harder to ignore. My senses were on high alert, every little sound amplified in the oppressive silence. The floor beneath my feet seemed to creak, the wooden beams overhead groaned as if the building itself were alive and waking up. And the whispers, they were there again, faint at first, but growing stronger, more distinct. "Don't leave," the voice whispered. "You belong here now." I froze. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The voice hadn't come from any one direction. It felt like it was inside my head, clawing at my thoughts. The coldness in the air thickened. My skin prickled with a sensation that something was moving in the shadows, something far older and more powerful than I could ever understand. My stomach twisted with fear, my body trembling as the weight of the air around me grew heavier, suffocating. I had to leave. I turned toward the door, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. My feet shuffled slowly, unwilling to break the stillness of the moment. I knew I couldn't stay here, but something was holding me back. I took another step forward, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. It was as if the ground had become a sticky web, keeping me rooted in place. The sound of my footsteps, soft, hesitant, was swallowed by the oppressive silence. But just as I reached for the door, a low, eerie laugh echoed in the distance, soft but chilling. It came from the very farthest corner of the church, the one that had always been hidden in shadows. It wasn't human. It was a sound like something inhuman, like something that didn't belong. I spun around, my pulse pounding in my ears. The shadows in the corner shifted, something moved, but I couldn't see what it was. It was there, just out of sight, a presence that was both heavy and intangible. The wind howled again, this time from inside the church, a sudden gust that made the walls groan in protest. The old wooden pews rattled, their metal fixtures scraping against the stone floor. I took a step back, my mind clouded with panic. I had to leave. I needed to get out. But the door, it wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, my hand slick with sweat, but it wouldn't budge. The door had been wide open when I entered, but now it seemed to be locked from the inside, as if the church itself had closed in around me. I pulled harder, my breath quickening, but the door refused to give. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air thickening with an unseen force. The shadows in the corner moved again, this time more clearly. A figure stepped out from the darkness. A figure in a long black robe. The nun. Her pale face was barely visible beneath the hood, but I could make out her eyes, black as pitch, empty of life. Her gaze locked onto mine, cold and devoid of any humanity. I took a step back, my throat dry, my voice trapped somewhere deep inside me. Her lips parted, but no sound came. And yet, I could hear her clearly in my mind. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice a ghostly echo. "Now you're ours." I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, unable to break free from her gaze. The shadows behind her seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that were more than just darkness, shapes that were moving, shifting, growing. The church was alive, and it was hungry. I tugged desperately at the door again, but the force holding it shut was too strong. It was as if the very building itself was preventing my escape. The nun's presence grew heavier, the air becoming thick with her malevolent energy. The wind had stopped, but I could feel her closing in on me, getting closer until her cold breath was on my skin. I was trapped. The events of the night had left me shaken. I barely slept, the image of the nun's cold, lifeless eyes lingering in my thoughts long after I had left the church. I tried to tell myself it was all just a trick of the mind, an overactive imagination, an eerie atmosphere that had gotten the best of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to know more. The next morning, I found myself in the small, dusty library of the town. The air inside was thick with the smell of old paper and mildew, the shelves creaking under the weight of books long forgotten. The librarian, a quiet woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, gave me a cursory glance as I entered, but said nothing. I knew what I was looking for, and I wasn't going to leave until I found it. I approached the old wooden desk in the corner of the room where several large, worn books lay scattered about. They looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, their covers cracked and faded. As I flipped through them, the librarian quietly shuffled past, her eyes narrowing when she saw what I was reading. "You might not want to look too closely at that," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not all things in this town are meant to be uncovered." But I didn't listen. I couldn't. Something in me, something deep and primal, drove me forward. I asked her if she had anything older, anything that might contain information about the church and its history. She hesitated for a moment, then motioned toward a small back room where the oldest manuscripts were stored. The room was dimly lit, with only a few flickering bulbs casting shadows across the dusty shelves. I pulled a thick leather-bound tome from one of the shelves and opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and covered in handwritten script. It looked like it had been written centuries ago. As I scanned the first few pages, a name caught my eye. Sister Agnes. The book detailed the early history of the church, from its construction to the lives of those who had served within its walls. Sister Agnes was one of the earliest nuns to join the convent, and she had been revered for her devotion and piety. But the further I read, the darker the story became. In the mid-1800s, something had changed. Sister Agnes, once known for her unwavering faith, became obsessed with a forbidden text, a book of rituals and dark rites that had been passed down through generations of ancient religious orders. She had discovered it hidden in the deepest recesses of the church, its pages worn and stained, filled with rituals that were never meant to be practiced. As I read the description of the ritual, my stomach twisted. It was an ancient, demonic ritual, one that promised power and eternal life in exchange for a soul. The ritual was forbidden by the church, considered blasphemous and dangerous. But Sister Agnes, driven by a desperation I couldn't fully understand, had attempted it. The ritual had failed, or rather, it hadn't. She had become something else. A creature, no longer human, bound to the church by a pact with dark forces. Her soul had been consumed, and in her place, something darker had emerged, something that now haunted the church, seeking to trap anyone who dared to enter. The manuscript went on to describe how she had become something otherworldly, her form twisted and corrupted by the ritual. Her once pure spirit had been corrupted, and she was now bound to the bell tower, where her demonic presence could reach out and draw in those who ventured too close. The bell, it seemed, was her voice, her call to those foolish enough to investigate. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I closed the book, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on me. Sister Agnes, now nothing but a demon, was still there. Trapped in the church, feeding on those who dared to uncover the truth. I had to stop this. But how? How could I face something like that? The librarian had been watching me from the doorway, her face pale and weary. "I told you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Some things are better left forgotten. The bell, it calls to those who seek answers. And once it calls you, it never lets you go." I stared at the book in my hands, the words blurring in my vision. There was no turning back now. I knew too much. And now, the church and its horrors were tied to me, whether I liked it or not. The bell had already sounded its call, and I had answered. But the question remained, how would I escape before it was too late? The more I read, the clearer it became. Sister Agnes had been consumed by her own ambition, her desire for power so great that she had been willing to sacrifice everything, including her soul. The book's pages were filled with descriptions of forbidden rituals, arcane ceremonies passed down through generations, hidden in the darkest corners of religious history. They were meant to invoke the power of the demonic, to trade one's soul for unimaginable strength and eternal life. The rituals were detailed, precise, and terrifying in their execution. And Sister Agnes had believed she could control them. It all started with her obsession. For years, Sister Agnes had been a devoted nun, humble and pious, serving the church with unwavering faith. But that devotion had begun to turn to frustration. Despite her prayers, her rituals, and her sacrifices, she felt she was being denied something deeper, something more powerful. She longed for divine understanding, for access to the ultimate truth. But truth, as she would soon discover, had a price. The manuscripts described how Sister Agnes had found an old tome hidden beneath the church's altar, a book bound in leather so dark it almost seemed to absorb the light. The book had been locked away, its pages marked with warnings in ancient, unreadable script. But to Agnes, it was an invitation. The book was filled with rituals of darkness, spells that promised to break the boundaries between the mortal world and the unknown. They offered power, immortality, and knowledge beyond human comprehension. It was a seductive promise, one that Agnes could not resist. In her desperation, she began to study the rituals in secret, poring over the pages by candlelight long after the other nuns had gone to bed. But the deeper she delved, the more her obsession grew. She had stopped praying to God and begun offering herself to forces she didn't fully understand. The ritual she chose was the most dangerous of them all, a ceremony designed to summon a demon and exchange a soul for power. The price was steep: sacrifice, surrender, and complete loss of self. But Agnes was convinced she could control it, convinced she could become more than human, more than just a servant of God. The night of the ritual, the church had been empty. The other nuns were away on retreat, leaving Agnes alone in the dark sanctuary. She had prepared everything carefully: the candles, the ancient symbols drawn in chalk on the cold stone floor, the incantations that had been spoken by those who had walked down this path before her. She recited the words with reverence, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. At first, nothing happened. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, the only sound the whisper of her own breath. But then, the air seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, and the flickering candle flames bent and twisted as if caught by an unseen wind. Suddenly, the bell rang. It was a low, mournful toll that vibrated through the very walls of the church. Agnes, now fully immersed in the ritual, didn't flinch. She continued chanting, her voice growing stronger, more forceful, as she called out to the dark entity she had invited into her life. And then, the transformation began. The book described it in haunting detail. Her skin began to stretch and twist, veins pulsing beneath the surface like dark rivers of corruption. Her eyes, once a clear, bright blue, turned black as midnight, hollow and void of any light. Her hands, which had once held the rosary with care, now curled into claw-like appendages, nails sharpening into wicked talons. Her body, once that of a devout servant of God, was being undone by the very forces she had sought to control. She screamed, a sound that was no longer entirely human, as her spine cracked and reformed into something monstrous. Her mouth split open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and her tongue flickered out like a serpent's. The transformation was agonizing, the price of her pact with the demon exacted in the most horrific way imaginable. But the demon's presence was not merely physical, it was an infection of the soul. The spirit of Sister Agnes, once pure and devoted, had been consumed, twisted, and reshaped into something unrecognizable. The demon had taken hold, making her its vessel, its puppet. And with that transformation, she became bound to the church, trapped by the very forces she had sought to command. The final part of the ritual, the most devastating, was the toll the demon demanded. It demanded a life to bind the pact, a soul to keep the power intact. But it was no longer Agnes's soul that mattered, it was the souls of others, those who dared to enter the church after her fall. The book's description of her final form made my stomach churn. She had become something else entirely, an entity, neither human nor demon, but a twisted amalgamation of both. Her very presence had become a corrupting force, drawing in those who were foolish enough to seek answers, to investigate the tolling bell. Her hunger for souls would never be sated. As I read through the pages, I could see the parallels to what had happened to me just a night before, the whispers, the coldness, the sense of being watched. It was all part of the same cycle, the same ritual that Agnes had begun long ago. She was still there, in the church, waiting. Her eyes, her touch, her hunger, they were all waiting for the next soul to step into the trap. And I couldn't help but wonder, was I already too far gone? Was I already part of the curse, trapped by my own curiosity, by my own need to understand? I had come looking for answers, but now I feared that I had already become part of the story. Sister Agnes's soul may have been lost, but the demon she had become would never let go. And now, I was tied to it. I closed the manuscript slowly, the weight of what I had just read settling in my chest. The librarian's warning echoed in my ears once more: some things are better left forgotten. But it was too late for me. I had already opened the door, and now the bell was calling for me again. The transformation was not sudden. It wasn't a sharp, immediate rupture from the woman Sister Agnes had once been into the demon she had become. No, it was a slow, insidious process, a gradual erosion of the very soul she had clung to. Each moment of the ritual, every whispered incantation, had been a step further into the abyss, each word a shackle, each movement a binding thread that would tie her fate to the demonic forces she thought she could control. The book had described it with cold, clinical detachment, but reading it was nothing like understanding it. As I continued to read, I could almost hear her voice, soft and trembling, yet filled with a creeping madness. Her inner turmoil, her desperation, echoed in the words. I could feel her fear, and I could hear her last screams as she succumbed to the forces she had invoked. At first, it had felt like a rush, a surge of power unlike anything she had ever known. Her senses had sharpened, her thoughts had become clearer, and she had felt a profound sense of enlightenment, as though she could finally see the world as it truly was, beyond the veil of earthly limitations. But with that clarity came an unshakable hunger and insatiable thirst for more. The power she had gained was intoxicating, yes, but it was also consuming. It whispered to her, urging her to push further, to abandon all that she had known, and to surrender herself fully to the darkness. And so, she had. The first physical signs had been subtle, a tremor in her hands, the feeling of coldness creeping up her spine. Her heart had begun to beat erratically, as if something inside her was shifting, trying to escape. Her skin, once soft and smooth, had begun to feel tight, stretched thin over something dark and writhing beneath. The change had been slow at first, barely noticeable, just a slight change in the hue of her skin, a faint pallor that she could attribute to exhaustion. But the hunger never relented. As the days wore on, she began to feel the transformation deep within her bones. The aching, gnawing hunger twisted inside her, making her desperate. She would awaken in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her chest tight, her limbs shaking with an unnatural energy. She could feel the air around her, thick with a suffocating heat, a dark energy that swirled and whispered, coaxing her toward the inevitable. The first true signs of her transformation had come on a night when she stood before the altar, praying as she had done 1,000 times before. But this time, something was different. Her reflection in the altar's brass mirror was wrong. It wasn't her face that stared back at her, it was something distorted, something monstrous. Her once clear eyes had turned black, her pupils swallowed by the dark void that now replaced her gaze. Her lips had pulled back into a twisted grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. At that moment, she realized there was no going back. The ritual had done its work, and the demon that had taken root in her soul was now fully awake. Her body began to contort, her limbs elongating, her fingers twisting into clawed talons. Her spine cracked and reformed, the vertebrae snapping into place as her body reshaped itself into something inhuman. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming power that surged through her veins. She could feel herself becoming something more, something beyond human, as if the world was bending to her will. She was no longer Agnes. She was something else, something darker. The sensation of her own body betraying her was excruciating. She could feel her skin splitting and stretching, her bones reshaping themselves into new, unfamiliar forms. Her fingers had transformed into twisted claws, sharp and unyielding, her nails growing thick and black like the talons of a predator. The muscles beneath her skin had retracted and contorted, becoming taut and powerful, filled with unnatural strength. Her face had become a mask of horror. Her once beautiful features were now grotesque, a chilling reflection of the demon that now inhabited her. Her eyes, once clear and filled with a quiet grace, were now black as night, voids of nothingness. They were windows into the abyss, reflecting the endless darkness that had claimed her soul. Her mouth had split open, impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth like jagged blades, each one razor-sharp and hungry for flesh. The sound of her own breath, harsh and labored, echoed in her ears, a reminder that she was no longer in control of her own body. And then, the bell tolled. It was a deep, mournful sound, reverberating through the very walls of the church. She had become one with it, as though the bell itself was part of her, calling out to those who dared to. Listen. It was a siren's song, a beckoning to the souls who had come to investigate, to uncover the truth she had left behind. But as her transformation completed, Sister Agnes was no more. The woman who had once been pious and humble had been swallowed whole by the demon inside her. What remained was a creature of nightmare, an entity bound to the church, its power feeding on those who dared to uncover its secrets. She had become a vessel, a conduit for dark forces, her soul lost to the void. There would be no redemption for her. No salvation. She had crossed the point of no return. As I read these words, I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. The transformation of Sister Agnes was not just a physical change, it was the destruction of everything that had once been human in her. The process was so complete, so absolute, that there was no trace of the woman who had been. Only the demon remained. And I realized with a creeping dread that the bell's toll, the one I had heard just the night before, was no accident. It was a warning, a call to those like me, who dared to investigate. It had been Sister Agnes's final act, her twisted legacy. And now, I too had answered the call. The transformation was not just hers. It was a cycle, an endless repetition of the horror she had started, a trap for anyone foolish enough to follow in her footsteps. I closed the manuscript with trembling hands, my mind racing. I had been so naive to think I could uncover the truth without consequences. Now I was part of her curse, bound to the church by my own curiosity. Just like Sister Agnes, I had no escape. The demon she had become was always hungry, always waiting for the next soul to fall into its grasp. And I wondered, in the deepest part of my soul, if the bell would toll for me next. The more I read, the clearer it became that Sister Agnes hadn't just performed a forbidden ritual. She hadn't merely sacrificed her soul. No, she had entered into a pact, an unholy covenant with the demon that now controlled her. A pact that had promised her power, eternal life, and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. But with that promise had come a price. In the beginning, when the demon first offered her the deal, Sister Agnes had been hesitant, almost fearful. She knew what it meant to bargain with forces beyond human understanding. She had been a nun, after all, a servant of God. She had known the dangers of dealing with the demonic. But her longing for power, for knowledge, for something beyond the limitations of her human existence had clouded her judgment. The demon had promised her the ability to transcend her mortal body, to live beyond the restrictions of time. In return, it demanded her soul, her very humanity. But that was a price she thought she could afford. She had thought she would be able to retain control, to be able to walk the line between the human and the demonic. But she was wrong. The moment she spoke the final words of the ritual, the moment she completed the incantation, the pact was sealed. The demon's power surged into her, flooding every fiber of her being. It was overwhelming, intoxicating. She could feel herself expanding, as though her very essence was spreading out into the world, reaching out to claim everything it touched. But as the power surged through her, it burned away her humanity. Every shred of kindness, every ounce of compassion, every memory of her former self was stripped away. She had become something else, something not entirely human, yet not fully demonic either. A twisted amalgamation of both, bound to the church, to the bell, to the demon who now controlled her. The first time she had felt the hunger, it had been unbearable. It gnawed at her insides, a ravenous emptiness that could only be sated by the souls of the living. The demon's voice had whispered to her, instructing her to wait, to bide her time. But she could feel the pull, the dark hunger growing stronger each passing day. It started small, at first. The bell tolled only at midnight, and she waited in the shadows, watching. She could feel the presence of the souls who ventured into the church, drawn by the strange ringing. They were curious, intrigued, unaware of the terrible fate that awaited them. And one by one, they fell. Her first victim had been a traveler, a weary man who had heard the bell from miles away. He had come into the church, seeking shelter, seeking answers. But what he had found was something far more terrifying. Agnes had lured him in with whispers, her voice soft and sweet like the wind rustling through the trees. She had promised him salvation, had promised him peace, but instead, she had dragged him into the depths of the darkness that had claimed her soul. The process was agonizing for him. He had screamed, begged for mercy as the demon inside her twisted his soul, pulling it from his body and sending it into the void. Agnes had stood there, watching, feeling the power of the demon surge through her with each soul claimed. It was intoxicating, like a drug that she could not stop taking. The hunger for more souls grew, and the more she consumed, the less of her humanity remained. With each soul, she grew stronger. The bell tolled more frequently, its mournful sound now a call to those who wandered too close to the church. They came, drawn by curiosity or fear, and they never left. The demon inside her was insatiable, demanding more, always more. The people who entered the church were never seen again. It didn't matter who they were or why they came. Once they crossed the threshold, they were doomed. Agnes had no mercy left in her, no compassion. She was no longer a servant of God, she was the harbinger of darkness, the demon's instrument, a predator hunting for souls. The process was always the same. The bell would toll, and the darkness would descend. Agnes would wait in the shadows, watching as the unfortunate souls entered, drawn by the sound. She would stand still, her monstrous form hidden in the darkness, until the moment the souls were close enough. Then, with a terrifying force, she would strike. She would seize them, drag them into the dark corners of the church, where the demon would feed on their souls. The transformation that had once been painful for her had become second nature. The demon's power flowed through her, and with it came the ability to twist and warp the souls of those who entered. She became more than just a monster, she became a gateway to the underworld, a vessel through which the demon could consume those who were foolish enough to listen to the bell. The pact, it seemed, had no end. The more she fed the demon, the more she lost herself. The power it granted her was endless, but so was the hunger. She had long ago forgotten what it meant to feel human, to have compassion. She was nothing more than a tool, a dark, twisted creature bound to the church by the pact she had made and the souls she had sacrificed. And yet, in the darkest part of her new existence, there was something left. a flicker of the woman she had once been. It was faint, buried beneath the layers of darkness and demonic influence, but it was there. Sometimes, when she stood alone in the church, staring at the bell, she could almost hear a whisper of her old self, a desperate plea for mercy, for redemption. But it was too late for that. The pact had been made, and there was no going back. The demon owned her now. And as the bell tolled again, I could feel its power reaching out, pulling me closer to the same fate. I was no longer just an observer. I had become part of the story, part of the pact. And soon, I would be just another soul lost to the darkness, another victim of the bell. The weight of the ancient texts in my hands felt heavier with every page I turned. I was no longer just a passive observer. My mind was racing, scrambling to process the horrific truth of what I had uncovered. Sister Agnes had never truly left the church. No, she had become something far darker, something far worse. The bell, the haunting sound that had so unnervingly echoed through the church night after night, wasn't merely a relic. It wasn't just the toll of an old mechanism or the product of some strange natural occurrence. It was a curse. And it was hers. As the last words of the manuscript burned into my mind, I felt my heart race. Sister Agnes hadn't simply died after the ritual. She had been consumed, yes, but she had also been bound. Her soul, twisted beyond recognition, had been trapped inside the church, forever tethered to the bell. Her pact had been so complete, so absolute, that the very sound of the bell was an extension of her demonic presence. I read the lines over and over, trying to make sense of the cryptic warning written in the margins by the original author, a priest who had known the terrifying truth but had failed to stop it. The bell is not a signal for help, nor a call for salvation. It is the demon's hunger. The bell tolls not to summon the lost, but to claim them. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The bell wasn't just some eerie noise in the night. It was a call, a lure, a trap. Each toll was a step deeper into the darkness, pulling those who ventured too close into its grasp. And I, like the others before me, had been drawn in by it. My breath caught in my throat as I sat back in my chair, the pages of the manuscript trembling in my hands. The fear that had been a low hum at the back of my mind now exploded, filling my thoughts. Sister Agnes, the demon she had become, was still in that church, waiting, watching. The bell was her instrument, her signal. It was more than just a haunting relic. It was part of her very being, a tether that kept her connected to the mortal world, one that allowed her to ensnare the living. And I had answered its call. I tried to steady my breathing, to push away the gnawing feeling of dread that was crawling up my spine, but it was no use. The thought of returning to that church now, of walking into the very place that had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a death sentence. How could I have been so blind? How could I not have seen the signs sooner? Suddenly, the image of the bell tolling at midnight filled my mind, louder now, more insistent, as though it were echoing through my very bones. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. I could hear it in my head, ringing and ringing until I thought my ears would bleed. My heart pounded in my chest as a sense of unease settled deep into my core. The bell wasn't just a warning. It was a countdown. The priest in the manuscript had written, "When the bell tolls for the final time, the one who listens will become a part of the cursed sound. Their soul, like all the others, will be consumed. Forever." A part of me, small but growing, wanted to flee, to run far, far away from that church and never look back. But I knew I couldn't. Something inside me, something inexplicable, was drawing me back. I had learned too much. I couldn't simply walk away and leave this mystery unsolved. And yet, I knew that returning meant facing a terrifying truth. I was already part of the story. The bell had called me for a reason. As if on cue, the ringing of the bell echoed in the distance, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the silence of the library like a knife. My heart stopped for a second. The toll was faint, but it was there. My stomach churned with fear. I had hoped it was a trick of the wind, a leftover echo from my memories, but I knew the truth now. The demon was still watching. It was only a matter of time before I became its next victim. The manuscript slipped from my hands as I stood, the weight of what I had learned pressing down on me. The bell was calling again. Would I heed it? Would I dare to return to the church where it all began? I didn't know how much longer I could resist. But I did know one thing: if I went back, I wasn't sure if I would ever return. Because if Sister Agnes had anything left of the person she once was, it was the dark hunger that still called to me. And I could feel it in my bones. The bell had already begun to toll again, and this time I could hear it in the back of my mind, like a whisper, beckoning. I returned to the church under the cover of night, a sense of dread hanging over me like a thick fog. The air was colder than it had been the first time I arrived, biting at my skin, making every breath feel like it might be my last. The church loomed before me, its silhouette sharp against the moonlit sky, as though it were watching, waiting for me to come closer. I could feel the weight of its presence on my chest, like a hand pressing down, refusing to let me breathe. The bell tower, once silent, seemed to echo with a quiet hum, a distant reminder of the curse that had claimed this place. Every step I took toward the entrance was heavy, like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. My mind raced, reminding me of everything I had read about the demon, about the pact, about the souls that had been lost to this place. But despite the terror clawing at my insides, I couldn't turn back. I had to know the truth. The doors of the church creaked as they swung open, the sound sharp in the stillness of the night. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold, my heart pounding in my chest. But then I stepped inside. Immediately, I felt the difference. The air inside was thick with something, an unnatural heaviness that pressed against me like a physical force. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind outside. And then, as if on cue, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate. It was as though someone, or something, was standing just out of view, watching me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the cold stone walls of the church, staring back at me with an empty, hollow gaze. I took a few cautious steps forward, the wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. My eyes darted to every shadow, every corner, expecting to see something lurking just beyond my vision. The silence stretched on, unnervingly so, until crack. The sound was sudden, sharp, and jarring. Like something heavy had fallen, or worse, something had stepped on a brittle bone. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my heart thundering in my chest as I waited for the next sound. Then came the soft scraping, like nails dragging across stone. It was so faint at first that I wondered if I had imagined it, but as I listened, it grew louder, closer, like something was moving just out of sight. I could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. My breath came out in visible clouds, my fingers trembling as I reached for the flashlight in my pocket. I flicked it on, but the beam of light barely cut through the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. But that didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made the silence even worse. The absence of noise felt like the calm before the storm, as if everything around me was waiting for something to happen. I moved cautiously toward the altar, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The further I ventured, the stronger the feeling became that I wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was here with me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the corner of my eye, something moving in the shadows. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the unease gnawing in my mind refused to let me ignore it. And then, a shadow moved again. This time, it was more distinct, more deliberate. It slid along the wall, just out of reach of the dim light, a long, dark form that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the stone. My pulse quickened, and I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the stillness. No response. The shadow didn't stop, didn't pause. It continued to creep along the edges of the room, inching closer to where I stood, like it was circling, stalking me. Suddenly, the bell rang. It was a single, deafening toll that shook the very foundations of the church. I flinched, my heart skipping a beat. The sound reverberated in my chest, as though the bell itself were trying to pierce through me. And then, from the shadows, I heard it. A soft whisper, so faint that it could have been the wind, or maybe it was something else. "You should have stayed away." The voice was low and distorted, almost unrecognizable, but there was no mistaking it. It was there, in the room with me. I spun around, searching for the source, but the darkness was overwhelming, pressing in from all sides. The church had become alive with whispers and shadows, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening, suffocating me. My pulse raced as I backed away, feeling as though the very walls were closing in on me. The shadows continued to move, stretching and shifting like living things, and I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. My mind was spinning, caught between the urge to run and the overwhelming need to understand. The bell rang again, louder this time, more insistent. And I knew, deep down, that I was not welcome here. Whatever was in the church, whatever had once been Sister Agnes, was still watching, still waiting. And I could feel it growing closer. A cold gust of air swept through the church, and I knew it was time to leave. But as I turned toward the door, I felt something cold brush against my neck, a touch that was far too deliberate to be the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I ran. I didn't look back. But as I fled the church, I could still hear the whisper in my mind. "You're not safe." And I knew it was true. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the church had left a mark on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the shadowy figures I had glimpsed the night before. The sound of the bell still echoed in my mind, its deep toll reverberating through my thoughts like a warning. I tried to distract myself, to move on, but the unease was never far behind. That evening, I couldn't resist the pull to return. The questions kept swirling in my mind, unanswered. The demon, Sister Agnes, the bell. It all felt connected, but I couldn't make sense of it. I needed to know more, to understand what had really happened to her, to the church. When I entered, the church felt different. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sort of static energy that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I couldn't help but notice that the shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. It was as though the darkness had thickened since my last visit, swirling in the corners like it was waiting for something. I walked slowly down the aisle, the echoes of my footsteps ringing out in the stillness. But then, just as I reached the altar, something shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air seemed to crackle with electricity. A cold breeze brushed my face, and I instinctively pulled my coat tighter around me. It was then that I saw it, a flicker, like a blur of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, dancing eerily across the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I questioned my own sanity. But then, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just the wind or the creaking of the old church. It felt deliberate. Help me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a voice from the outside. It came from within, as if the church itself were speaking to me. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked around, trying to find the source. And that's when I saw her. A figure, faint at first, but growing clearer as it approached. She stood at the far end of the church, draped in the familiar black and white habit of a nun. Her face was obscured by shadow, but I could see the faint outline of her features, sharp and angular. It was Sister Agnes, her form translucent, ethereal, yet somehow real. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot, staring at her as she seemed to float toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. Her presence felt oppressive, as if she were sucking the air from the room. The whispers grew louder, echoing through my mind, until they became words I couldn't ignore. It's not over. You shouldn't have come back. You must leave before it's too late. Her voice was low, almost a growl, full of bitterness and pain. I could see the torment in her eyes, even though they were hollow, devoid of any humanity. The weight of her gaze was unbearable, as though she could see straight through me, as though she knew everything about me. Suddenly, the vision shifted. I was no longer standing in the church, but in a dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old stone, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. I could hear soft chanting in the distance, distant and muffled, as though coming from a different realm. But there was a sense of urgency in the air, a sense of dread. Sister Agnes stood before an altar, the dim light casting long shadows across her face. Her eyes were wild with a kind of desperation, her lips trembling as she muttered a prayer, or was it a chant? Her hands were raised, and I could see something in them, something dark and twisting. A book, no, a tome, ancient and bound in black leather. She was performing the ritual. She was calling something from the darkness. Her voice grew louder, the words of the incantation echoing in the room. The air around her thickened, growing heavier by the second. I could feel it too, something ancient and malevolent pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, just as the chant reached its peak, there was a flash of light, blinding and fierce. I gasped, and the scene shifted again. I saw Sister Agnes on the floor, writhing in agony, her body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. The shadows that had surrounded her seemed to move on their own, like they were alive, crawling over her body, melding with her flesh. Her screams were deafening, tearing through the air. But they weren't screams of fear, they were screams of pain, of something much worse than death. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The vision held me captive. The walls seemed to close in as the dark force overtook her, wrapping around her like a shroud until her form was consumed entirely. Her body was no longer human. She had become something else, something darker, something far more powerful. The demon had claimed her. "You did this to me," the voice whispered in my ear, harsh and twisted. It wasn't her voice anymore. It was the demon's. "Now you are mine. You cannot escape." The vision shattered, and I was back in the church, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The ghostly image of Sister Agnes lingered before me, her face a twisted mask of agony and rage. The room was colder now, the air thick with the presence of something malevolent. I tried to back away, but I could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as though they were alive and watching. The bell rang again. Once. Twice. 3 times. But this time, I wasn't just hearing it in my head. The sound filled the church, louder and clearer than ever before. I could feel it deep in my bones, vibrating through my very soul. Sister Agnes was no longer just a ghost. She was here. And she was angry. As the bell's final toll reverberated through the church, the air around me thickened, pressing down like an invisible weight. My heart raced, and every breath felt labored as if the very atmosphere itself was conspiring against me. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and despite the chill, the sensation of heat swirled around my chest, making me feel like I was suffocating. It was as if something was tightening its grip on me, slowly, inexorably. The darkness, once only a vague presence, had grown. It wasn't just in the corners of the church anymore, it was everywhere. It was inside me, under my skin, in the deepest recesses of my thoughts. The shadows seemed to pulse, vibrating in sync with my heartbeat, an eerie rhythm that echoed deep within my chest. My mind was clouded, as if my thoughts were no longer my own. And then came the whispers again, softer this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. "You cannot escape. You are already ours." I spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing. Yet the voice was so clear, so real, that I could feel its presence like a physical force pressing against my eardrums. I staggered backward, my body trembling, the walls of the church beginning to close in on me. Every time I tried to look away from the shadows, they seemed to grow, to spread. It felt like the very church itself had turned into a living thing, a grotesque entity that was feeding off my fear. My fingers clenched into fists, nails biting into the palms of my hands as I fought to regain control over my racing thoughts. But it was no use. The presence was stronger now. It was inside my head. I tried to reach out, to steady myself by gripping the back of one of the pews, but the wood seemed to shift beneath my touch, like it was moving, breathing with its own pulse. The sensation of something watching me was overwhelming. I could almost hear the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me, mimicking my own every movement. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but that only made it worse. It was as if my mind was now part of the church, part of the curse. I could feel her, Sister Agnes, her presence pushing against the fragile boundaries of my consciousness, her anger, her despair, her hunger for my soul. "You belong to me," the voice hissed, now so close that I could almost feel her breath on my ear. I flinched and stumbled backward, my head spinning, my vision blurring as I gasped for air. But the air had become thick, like breathing underwater. The whispers grew louder, louder than the pounding of my own heartbeat, louder than the bells ringing that still seemed to echo in the walls. The church was no longer just a building. It was a cage, a prison that held me in place, suffocating me with its malevolent presence. The temperature dropped again, colder than before, and I could feel the fingers of the shadows reaching out for me, brushing my skin with icy fingers that made my whole body jerk in fear. There was no escape. I realized that now. There was nowhere to go, no way out. The church had claimed me, and with it, the curse that had been laid upon it. Sister Agnes, now a demon, was no longer confined to the past. She was here, in the very air I breathed, in the very thoughts I thought. She was in my mind, wrapping around my soul, tightening her grip with every passing second. "You are mine," she whispered again, her voice sending chills down my spine. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. And the more I tried to resist, the tighter her hold on me became. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. My body refused to move, as if it had been frozen in place by some unseen force. I was trapped, alone with her in this cursed space, and I knew deep down that there was no escape from what was coming next. The darkness had taken root in me, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed me completely. I couldn't breathe. The shadows around me pressed in, thickening, suffocating me with every passing moment. It was as if the very walls of the church had come alive, their stone surfaces breathing with the same rhythmic pulse as my own heart. The darkness wasn't just something I could see, it was something I could feel, something I could taste. It was heavy, thick, and oppressive, crawling over my skin like insects, moving through the air, filling my lungs with its cold, suffocating weight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the tiles warping as though the church itself were reshaping, bending reality. I turned to the door, but it was no longer the same. The entrance, once an open path to escape, was now just another shadowed archway, distorted, unreachable. The dark presence that surrounded me had sealed me inside. The bell rang again, once, twice, 3 times. But this time, it wasn't just the sound of metal tolling. It was the sound of something ancient, something far older than the church itself. It vibrated deep within me, resonating in the marrow of my bones, as if the bell was calling me, pulling me into its grip. I could feel it, the pressure building in my chest, like my ribs were being compressed by the weight of the curse itself. I stumbled back, desperate, my hands fumbling against the cold stone walls. I was trying to find a way out, any way out. But it was as if the very space around me had become a trap, a labyrinth that folded in on itself. The hallways I had walked down only hours ago now twisted and contorted into impossible shapes, leaving me disoriented, unable to make sense of where I was or where I was supposed to go. Each corner I turned seemed to bring me back to the same place, to the same altar, where the flickering shadows whispered my name. I could hear her now, her voice growing louder, more commanding. "You can't escape. You belong to me." The words weren't just spoken, they were felt, seeping into my mind like poison, taking root in my thoughts. The demon, Sister Agnes, was inside me now, her presence clawing at the edges of my consciousness, tightening its grip with every passing second. "You will be mine." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice echoed through my skull, drowning out all other sound, all other thought. It was the only thing that existed now, a constant, gnawing presence that refused to be ignored. I turned and ran, not sure if I even knew where I was going anymore. The church had become a maze, every hallway a mirror of the last, every doorway a dead end. The light from the stained glass windows flickered and distorted, casting grotesque, shifting shapes across the floor. I felt as though I was being hunted, the darkness closing in around me, watching me from every corner. The walls seemed to lean in, as though the church itself was trying to suffocate me, to swallow me whole. I reached the back of the church, the small door leading out to the courtyard just in sight. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. I pulled, but it didn't budge. It was locked. The panic surged, rising in my throat like bile. I tried again, desperate, but the door held fast. There was no escape. The darkness had sealed me in. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered again, its tone a sickening blend of malice and triumph. "You are mine. Forever." I could feel her, feel the demon within me, writhing in the depths of my mind. It was like a cold, slick hand wrapped around my heart, squeezing, pulling me down into the darkness. My vision blurred as the shadows closed in, the room spinning, and I realized, in that moment of pure terror, that I wasn't just trapped in the church. I was trapped inside myself. There was no way out. I wasn't going to escape. And as the darkness crept closer, as the last remnants of my own thoughts began to fade, I knew that I had already lost. I was already gone. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen to the ground, unable to carry me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat sending waves of panic crashing over me, but it didn't matter. My body refused to obey. It was as if the very fear that gripped my mind had spread to my limbs, paralyzing me from within. I was a prisoner of my own terror, caught in the suffocating grip of the darkness. The church had become a maze of endless corridors, twisting in impossible ways, yet I still tried to escape. My breath was ragged, shallow, as I staggered forward, my hands reaching blindly for any surface that might offer a sense of stability. But the walls, no, the whole place, seemed to shift with every step I took. They stretched and compressed, playing tricks on my senses, making it impossible to trust anything. I could feel the shadows creeping closer, inching toward me like a living thing. It was in the air, a thick, suffocating fog that wrapped itself around me, squeezing the life out of my lungs. The temperature had dropped again, far colder than it had ever been, and the chill sank deep into my bones. It wasn't just a physical cold, it was something deeper, a cold that froze my very soul. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was walking through water, my legs dragging through a thick, viscous substance that slowed me down, weighed me down. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion. It was the fear, the growing sense that I was no longer walking through the church. No, I was walking through a nightmare of my own making. The walls, the floor, the very air around me had all turned against me, and I could feel the demon's presence growing stronger with every moment. "You cannot leave," the voice echoed, reverberating in my skull like a drumbeat. "You are mine now. Forever." I spun around, trying to find the source, but there was no one. There was nothing. Only the oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft, rhythmic creaking of the church as it seemed to breathe in time with me. I was going mad. I had to be. The fear was too much, the pressure too great. I felt like I was losing myself, slipping into a dark void where nothing existed but the demon's voice and the suffocating darkness. I stumbled, my hands clutching at the walls as I tried to steady myself. My mind was spiraling, a whirlwind of panic and dread that clouded all reason. "I can't do this," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling with fear. "I need to leave. I have to get out." But deep down, I knew it was a lie. There was no escaping. The church had become my prison, and the demon's grip on me was tightening with every breath I took. The door I had tried to open before was no longer an option. The windows, once an escape route, were now sealed tight, their glass warped and distorted. Every exit I had tried to find had vanished. There was no escape, no hope. The walls had closed in on me, and the darkness had swallowed me whole. I could feel it now, like a hand gripping my throat, squeezing, tightening. I could feel the demon's cold fingers wrapping around my neck, pulling me deeper into the void. My vision blurred, the edges of reality fraying like a torn piece of cloth, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that I was slipping away. The whispers had become louder now, more urgent, almost triumphant. "You are mine," they hissed, each word a barb in my mind, each syllable a step closer to the edge of oblivion. "You cannot escape. There is no way out." I wanted to scream, to run, to fight against it, but my body refused to obey. It was as if I was bound to this place, chained to the very walls of the church, my soul locked away in the prison of my own fear. And then it hit me. The church wasn't just trapping me. It was consuming me. Every step I took was leading me deeper into its grasp, deeper into the demon's control. It was never about escaping. It was about losing myself, becoming another soul trapped in the endless cycle of fear, feeding the darkness that had taken root here so long ago. I had become part of the curse. There was no salvation, no escape. I was lost. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was her voice, soft but unyielding. "You belong to me now." And with that, everything went black. The darkness that had suffocated me for what felt like an eternity began to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, almost as if it were alive, beating in sync with my panicked heart. My mind was foggy, my vision blurred, but through the haze, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A figure emerged from the shadows, its outline forming slowly, purposefully, as though it had been waiting for me to notice it. At first, it seemed like a person, a woman, standing tall in the dark, her silhouette faintly illuminated by the flickering light of the stained glass windows. But then, the details began to sharpen. The figure's face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. Her lips twisted into a thin, mocking smile, but there was nothing human left in her expression. I froze. It was her, the woman I had seen in the old manuscripts. The one who had become the demon. She was Sister Agnes, or at least, what was left of her. Her habit, once white and pure, was now tattered and stained with a darkness that seemed to crawl up her robes like living ink. The once gentle, nurturing figure of a nun had twisted into something monstrous, something far beyond human comprehension. Her hands, once folded in prayer, were now claw-like, long fingers that stretched unnaturally toward me, as if beckoning me into the depths of her domain. Her voice echoed through the church, reverberating in my skull, each word laced with cold malice. "You cannot hide from me. You are mine now." The air grew colder still, the temperature plummeting to unbearable levels. I could see my breath in the air, thin wisps of fog curling out with every ragged inhale. I took a step back, my legs shaking uncontrollably, but the demon's eyes locked onto mine, and I knew I couldn't escape. "You are already trapped," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody that twisted inside my chest. "This church is my prison, and now it is yours as well." I stumbled backward, desperate to find a way out, but every direction I turned seemed to lead me back to her. The walls pressed in, the stained glass windows distorted by the encroaching darkness, and I realized that no matter how far I ran, there would be no escape. The church had become an extension of her, an inescapable trap where her power was limitless. "I gave up my soul for power," Sister Agnes continued, her voice growing louder, "and now I shall claim yours." I could feel the weight of her words in my bones. The air around me seemed to grow heavier with each syllable, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. My mind was swirling, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. This wasn't just some haunting or some twisted apparition. This was real. This was the result of the forbidden ritual, the pact with the demon that had damned not just Agnes, but everyone who entered this cursed place. I tried to move, to run, to fight, but my body felt like it was made of lead. The fear gripped me tighter than ever, locking me in place. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The demon was toying with me, watching me squirm, her unblinking gaze devouring every ounce of my resistance. With a sudden, jerking movement, she raised her hand, and the air crackled with an oppressive energy. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, warping and bending as though the very reality around me was folding in on itself. The shadows came alive, reaching out to me like tendrils, wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me toward her. "You will join me," she purred, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "just as all those before you have. There is no escape from this fate. The bell rings for those who are called to me, and you were always meant to come." I screamed in my mind, fighting against the pull, but it was useless. The darkness was stronger than my will, stronger than anything I had ever known. I could feel my strength draining away, my vision dimming as the shadows enveloped me. It was then that I realized there was no escape. The demon, in her monstrous form, was not just a physical entity. She was part of the church, part of its history, and now she was part of me. "You are mine," she said once more, her voice an echo in my skull, "and you will never leave." And with that, I felt my very essence begin to dissolve, swallowed by the darkness she had created. The last thing I saw before the shadows overtook me was her smile, a wicked, triumphant grin. And then, everything went black. The darkness pressed in on me from all sides, suffocating, relentless. I was trapped. Every movement I made seemed to only draw me further into her grip, the air thick with the weight of her malevolent presence. The demon, Sister Agnes, loomed over me, her eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. But I couldn't let go. I refused to. I had to fight. There had to be a way out. My mind raced. The old manuscripts, the ones I pored over in the library, flashed in my mind. There had to be something, anything in them that could help me. Desperation surged through me as I fumbled through my memories, clinging to the fragments of knowledge I gained. There was a ritual, a protective chant, one that could shield me from the demon's power. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. "I can do this," I whispered to myself, even as the shadows around me seemed to whisper back in mocking tones. "I have to do this." My breath hitched as I struggled to gather the words, trying to recall the ancient incantations I had read about. The demon's voice, soft and sickeningly sweet, filled my ears, making it hard to concentrate. "You cannot fight me, little one," she cooed. "Your efforts are futile. You are already mine." Ignoring her, I began to chant the words from the manuscript, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength with each syllable. The air around me shifted as I spoke, a faint pulse of energy responding to my call. For a moment, I thought it was working. The darkness around me seemed to falter, like it was hesitating, pulling back, giving me just a sliver of hope. But then, with a sudden, thunderous roar, the shadows surged forward, crashing into me like an unstoppable tide. The demon laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the church. I felt the power of her presence grow, the very air vibrating with her strength. "You think you can stand against me?" she sneered, stepping closer. I was born of darkness. Your pathetic little rituals cannot harm me. My knees buckled under the weight of her words, and I stumbled backward, barely catching myself against a cold stone pillar. My hands shook as I tried to steady myself, but I knew deep down that it was useless. Every chant, every prayer, every attempt to fight was only feeding her power. The darkness was growing stronger, consuming everything in its path. I couldn't stop it. The demon's figure flickered in and out of the shadows, her form distorting as if it were not bound by the laws of reality. She was no longer just a woman, but a twisted, monstrous thing, her face a grotesque mask of rage, her hands now claws, her mouth full of jagged, broken teeth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide as she grinned. "You are weak," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You cannot escape what is inevitable. You will be like the others, trapped in the darkness, lost forever." I clutched at my chest, my breath coming in short gasps as I realized the full weight of my situation. The ritual had done nothing. The church was not merely a building, it was part of her, a manifestation of her power. There was no protection here. No way to fight her. She stepped closer, and the shadows around her grew more solid, more alive, like tendrils reaching out to claim me. My pulse raced as I turned to flee, but the walls themselves seemed to close in, tightening around me, forcing me back toward her. "Where are you going?" she purred, her voice oozing with satisfaction. "There is nowhere left to run. Nowhere you can hide from me." I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as she advanced. Her presence was suffocating, pressing in on me from every angle, every breath I took like a weight upon my chest. The church had become a labyrinth of nightmares, and there was no escape. In that moment, the reality of my situation settled in like a cold weight. The demon was too powerful. My efforts had been nothing more than a futile attempt to defy fate. There was no way out. No salvation. "Your soul will be mine," she whispered, her voice sweet and final. Just as it was always meant to be. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the last of my strength drained away. My vision blurred, the edges of reality fraying as I faced the truth I had lost. And then, everything went dark. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It had become an oppressive weight that pressed down on me, filling my lungs, choking me with every breath. My mind raced, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. It felt as though I was caught in the very air around me, trapped within an invisible web spun by the demon's unrelenting power. Sister Agnes, no, the demon that once was her, was no longer merely a figure in front of me. She had become a part of my mind, my thoughts, creeping into the corners of my consciousness with every passing moment. Her presence was all-encompassing, a constant whisper in my ear, even when she wasn't speaking. "You cannot hide," her voice purred, though it wasn't coming from her lips anymore. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a constant hum of oppressive force that vibrated through my skull. "I see everything. I know everything. Your thoughts, your fears. I'm always watching." I tried to look around, to find her, to face her, but my vision swam. The edges of the room wavered as though reality itself was slipping away from me. I tried to move, to rise from where I had collapsed, but my body felt as if it were weighed down by invisible chains. My limbs were frozen, completely paralyzed. I couldn't even lift a finger. "What's the matter?" the demon mocked, her voice cutting through the fog in my mind. "Don't you want to fight? Don't you want to survive?" I could feel her smile without seeing it. Her amusement was palpable, and it fueled the terror that was slowly smothering me. She wasn't just trying to break my body, she was breaking my mind. The fear in my chest turned cold, solidifying into a deep, unshakable dread. Her words, her presence, began to fill every corner of my mind, making it impossible to distinguish between what was real and what was her doing. Was I still in the church? Or had I already crossed over into her domain, lost in a nightmarish limbo? I could hear the bell. The bell that had first drawn me here, the bell that had rung every night without fail. But now it was different. It wasn't just the sound of a bell, it was a constant ringing in my ears, echoing inside my skull, becoming louder and louder until I felt as though it was all that existed. My heartbeat matched its rhythm, and I realized with growing horror that the sound was no longer separate from me. It was inside me. The demon's influence had taken hold. I was no longer in control of my own thoughts. "You are so easy to break," the demon crooned, her voice slipping into the crevices of my mind. "You think you can outsmart me? You think you can escape me?" I tried to push back, to force myself awake from this nightmare. But the harder I tried, the harder it became to distinguish reality from illusion. Was I even awake? Was this truly happening, or was I trapped in some dark corner of my mind, tangled in a web of her making? I could feel her eyes on me, even when I couldn't see her. It was as if her gaze was a tangible thing, pressing down on me, suffocating me from within. "I've been watching you," she whispered, her voice warm and thick with malice. "All this time, I've been watching. Every moment of fear. Every doubt. I see it all." The walls of the church shifted. The wooden pews bent and creaked as though they were alive, their shapes warping into distorted, monstrous figures that loomed over me. I felt them press in on me, closing the space, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The more I tried to fight, the more exhausted I became. And then it happened. A sensation, no, an understanding that I had never felt before. The knowledge that I wasn't alone, that there were eyes on me from all directions. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, feel her, watching every move I made, controlling every thought I had. Was this what she had wanted all along? To break me so completely that I would no longer be able to distinguish my own will from hers? "I know what you're thinking," she whispered again, her voice like a gentle caress. "You're wondering if this is real, aren't you? If any of this is real." My heart raced. I tried to tell myself that I could break free, that I could fight back, but the more I fought, the more the darkness consumed me. Her grip on my mind was becoming unbreakable. "You will doubt yourself," she continued, her words a poisonous lullaby. "You will wonder if you've already lost. And that is when I will take you." I felt myself slipping, my resolve shattering like glass under the weight of her manipulation. I no longer knew where I was, what was real, or who I was. The boundaries between the physical world and the nightmare I was trapped in had dissolved, and all that remained was the suffocating presence of the demon pulling me deeper into her control. I was no longer fighting for survival. I was simply trying to hold on to some shred of me, but even that was slipping away. "You are mine," the demon whispered one last time, her voice final, absolute. "And you always will be." And with that, I felt myself fall deeper into the abyss. I could feel the darkness closing in on me, a suffocating force that seemed to twist and coil around my very soul. The demon's presence had consumed every corner of the church, every crevice of my mind. Her influence was a heavy weight pressing down on me, keeping me paralyzed, trapped in the web she had spun. But despite the growing fear, Despite the oppressive shadow that threatened to crush me, there was still a flicker of defiance left within me. I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. I had come here seeking answers, thinking I could break the curse. But now, I knew what I had to do. I had to confront her head on, face the very force that had twisted this place into a nightmare. And for that, I needed to summon every ounce of strength and knowledge I had gathered. My mind raced, recalling the ancient texts I had found, the fragments of rituals, the forbidden incantations that spoke of banishing evil, of breaking the bonds between demons and the mortal world. I had studied them obsessively, but now, in the face of overwhelming terror, I wasn't sure they would work. Would I be able to perform them in time? Would I even be able to move? "You cannot escape," the demon whispered, her voice creeping into my thoughts like a poisonous vine. "I am everywhere. I am within you. There is no escaping me now." I felt her words penetrate deep into my consciousness, trying to push me into submission. It was a struggle just to think clearly. But I pushed back. I refused to be a puppet in her twisted game. I closed my eyes, focusing on the ritual. I had to trust the knowledge I had painstakingly gathered. I knew what I had to do, but the fear gnawed at me. If I failed, if I hesitated for even a second, she would take me, just as she had taken so many before. Taking a deep breath, I began to chant the words from the ancient texts. The incantation felt foreign on my tongue, the syllables heavy and difficult to pronounce. The air around me seemed to shift as I spoke, a low hum vibrating through the floorboards beneath me. The church, once a place of solace, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in, the atmosphere thickening with each word I uttered. "You think a few words will stop me?" The demon's laugh echoed in my mind, mocking, venomous. "I am the darkness that dwells within this place. You cannot command me." But I pressed on. My voice quivered, but my determination was unwavering. Each word seemed to pull me deeper into the ritual, into the very heart of this place where the veil between worlds was thinnest. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, but I refused to let her break me. She had already taken so much. She would not take me, not now. The ground beneath me began to tremble. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the church, shaking the very foundations. It felt like the walls themselves were screaming, as if the building itself was alive and fighting back against the force I was summoning. But I held firm. I had come too far to turn back now. The demon's presence surged, a tidal wave of malevolent power that threatened to drown me. I could feel her clawing at my mind, trying to break my concentration. "You're mine," she screamed. "You can't win. You will be destroyed." But as I chanted the final words of the incantation, something within me snapped into place. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the center of the church, blinding me for a moment. The air around me crackled with energy, and I could feel the demon's grip weakening. She shrieked in fury, a sound so filled with rage that it rattled my bones. For a split second, the shadows lifted. The weight of her presence lessened, and I felt a rush of hope, a fleeting, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the ritual was working. But then, just as quickly, the light dimmed, and the demon's power surged once more. The temperature in the church plummeted, and I felt the chills seep deep into my bones. My heart raced, and panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Had I failed? Was this it? Would I be her next victim, like all the others before me? But no! I couldn't give up. Not now. I gathered every shred of strength I had left, pushing the fear back, focusing on the chant once more. The demon's power was fading, but she wasn't done. She wouldn't go down without a fight. And neither would I. With every ounce of my will, I completed the ritual, the final words tumbling from my lips like a prayer. The air around me snapped like a taut wire, and the church shook violently. The shadows writhed, fighting against the power I had unleashed, but slowly, ever so slowly, the demon's form began to flicker. She screamed in agony, her once human form distorting, warping, as the energy from the ritual tore through her. I could feel the weight of her presence finally starting to dissipate, the suffocating grip she had on me loosening. And with one final, gut-wrenching shriek, she disappeared, vanishing into the ether with a gust of wind that slammed the church door shut behind her. Silence. The oppressive air was gone. The shadows that had once clung to the walls were now nothing more than fading memories. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my body trembled from exhaustion, but I was alive. I had done it. For a moment, I stood there in the stillness, unsure if it was truly over. Had I defeated the demon? Had I freed this cursed place from her grasp? And then, I realized with a shudder that I would never truly know. The church was still here, its walls still steeped in mystery, its bells still ringing every midnight. The past had been shattered, but the echoes of that past would haunt me forever. I had won, but at what cost? I could feel her presence again, like a suffocating cloud, creeping into every inch of my being. The air turned heavy, as though it had been charged with an unseen force, and my heart began to race. The battle I had thought was over, the final moments of the ritual, had only been the calm before the storm. I had banished her once, but now she was coming for me again. This time, I understood that it was no longer just about survival. It was about my soul, my very essence, and whether I would walk away free or be forever bound to her darkness. She wasn't just a demon, she was a force, an eternal presence in this place. She had been here long before me, and she would remain long after. The church began to distort, the familiar walls warping and shifting like the reflections in a broken mirror. The cold, suffocating presence of the demon grew stronger, and I could feel her fingers curling around my mind, trying to take hold, to drag me back into the depths from which I had only just escaped. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow, but there was no place to hide. The church had become her domain, and I was a mere pawn in her game. She appeared in front of me, not the fragile, broken figure she had once been, but something far worse. Her human form was long gone, replaced by a nightmarish visage that was barely recognizable. Her eyes, now nothing more than black voids, locked onto mine. She no longer needed words, her very presence was a command, an order that I would obey, whether I wanted to or not. "You cannot escape," she hissed, her voice reverberating in my mind like 1,000 whispers. "You belong to me now. Your soul is mine, and you will never leave this place." I felt her words sink into my very being, latching onto my fears, my doubts. The rituals had worked, yes, but the cost was not just physical. It was mental. The moment I had stepped into this church, I had unknowingly bound myself to it. It was a pact, one forged in blood, and there would be no escaping it. No matter how much I tried to fight, there would always be a part of me that belonged to her. She stepped closer, her feet making no sound against the stone floor. My legs felt like they were made of lead, unable to move. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, as if they were alive, obeying her every command. The bell rang in the distance, a loud, resonating chime that echoed through the hollow church, reverberating deep within me like a warning. I had done everything I could. I had fought her at every turn, using everything I had learned to resist her, to push her back. But I was failing. Every ounce of energy I had spent, every moment I had struggled, none of it mattered. The demon was too powerful, and now she was going to claim me. I realized, in that moment, that I had never been fighting to survive. I had been fighting to protect what little remained of my humanity, to preserve my soul from being consumed by the darkness that had already claimed so many others before me. But now, I was beginning to understand that there was no winning this fight, not in the way I had hoped. The finality of the situation settled on me like a heavy weight, and I knew that even if I somehow managed to break free, I would never be the same. The demon's grip on me would leave scars, deep, invisible scars that would follow me for the rest of my life. Her eyes gleamed as she reached out, her cold fingers grazing my skin. I could feel the pull of her power, a sickening, oppressive force that seemed to wrap around my heart, squeezing it tight. It was as if she were reaching into me, tearing at my very essence. "You're mine," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. "Your soul has always been mine. You were just too blind to see it." A strange, empty feeling began to wash over me. I could feel her clawing at my mind, trying to make me forget everything, to make me a part of her twisted reality. But despite the overwhelming despair, a spark of defiance remained within me. I wasn't going to give in. Not without a fight. In that moment of clarity, I realized that this wasn't just about escaping her or surviving. It was about resisting the pull of darkness that sought to consume me. I was no longer trying to save myself from the demon. I was fighting for the last shred of light that still flickered within me. I reached deep inside, drawing on the last remnants of strength I had. The darkness seemed to close in tighter, but I focused on the one thing that had always kept me grounded, my will to live, my desire to escape this hell. With a scream, I broke free from her grasp, pushing her influence aside, if only for a moment. But I knew this wouldn't last. The demon would come again, stronger than ever. She would never truly let me go. As I stumbled toward the door, I felt her presence linger, a dark shadow in the corner of my mind. But for now, I was free. The church doors slammed open, and I stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a splash of water. I had won, but at what cost? As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the demon was still with me. The bell continued to toll in the distance, a haunting reminder of the curse that still lingered in that forsaken church. And though I had escaped with my body, my soul, that was another matter entirely. In the end, I realized there was no escape from the darkness. It would follow me wherever I went. The air was thick with tension as I walked back into the church. Despite everything, despite the fear, the torment, the whispers that had followed me like shadows, I knew I had no choice. I had to face her. There was no running anymore, no more hiding behind the walls of the past or trying to escape. I was in the heart of her power now, and I was going to either leave this place free, or I would never leave at all. The bell tolled again, echoing through the empty halls like a death knell. It was louder this time, more insistent, almost mocking me. I could feel her presence before I saw her. She was waiting, as always. Waiting for me to step into the trap she had so carefully laid. The light from the candles flickered as if struggling to stay alive, casting long, twisted shadows that danced across the walls. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in front of me, a fog of fear hanging in the air. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, my feet sinking into the cold stone floor. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast void that consumed everything in its path. And then, from the blackness, she emerged. The demon, in the form of the once holy nun, stepped into the dim light. Her face was a mask of horror, twisted with both rage and something more, something almost sadistic. Her eyes, black as pits, locked onto mine, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. She was the very embodiment of my fear, my guilt, my doubts. "You should never have come back," she hissed, her voice both ancient and cold, as though it had lived for centuries in the deepest corners of the earth. Her form seemed to flicker, shifting between her human and demonic visage, making it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, every instinct telling me to turn and run, but there was no running now. She had me. But I had something she didn't, the knowledge, the will, and a last shred of defiance. I had spent days, weeks, researching, learning everything I could about the rituals, the demon, the past. I had to face her, and I had to do it now, with everything I had. "You cannot win," she continued, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "I am eternal. I was here before you, and I will remain after you." I swallowed hard, my breath shaky, but I didn't falter. This was it. My final chance. In my hand, I held the Book of Rituals, the ancient text I had studied so carefully. The pages had once seemed to hold answers, but now they felt heavy, almost too much to bear. The knowledge that had given me hope now seemed to mock me. Was it enough? Could I truly rid myself of this demon? Or had I already lost long before I even stepped through the doors? The demon's laughter echoed in the church, mocking me, breaking through my thoughts. "You are so weak," she taunted. "All your research, all your struggle, will do nothing. You cannot escape me. I will feast on your soul as I have feasted on so many before you." I had to believe she was wrong. I had to. There was no other choice. I stepped forward, the book shaking in my hands, but my resolve firm. She didn't know what I had learned. She didn't know how close I was to ending this. The ritual wasn't just about power, it was about understanding, about seeing through the veil she had woven. The demon's strength lay in fear, in the uncertainty of those who dared to confront her. But I had faced that fear already. And now, I was ready. I recited the words, ancient, chilling, and full of power. The church seemed to shudder as the words left my lips, the very air growing tense with the weight of the spell. The ground beneath me trembled, the candles flickering wildly as if struggling against the dark force that surrounded us. The demon screamed in fury, the sound a horrible mix of human and inhuman, a piercing shriek that shook me to my core. "No," she screamed, her form convulsing as if trying to resist the force I had unleashed. "You can't do this. You're nothing but a mortal, a weak little soul who dares to defy me. I am eternal. I am." Her words were cut short as the spell took hold, the light from the candles flaring up, flooding the church with a blinding radiance. I could feel the demon's power trying to fight back, but it was weakening. Her form flickered once more, this time revealing the true horror of her nature, writhing, shifting, as though she were trapped between worlds. But just as quickly as she had emerged, the demon's form began to disintegrate, her once immense power crumbling to dust. The air became still, the tension lifting like the final breath of a dying creature. I collapsed to my knees, my heart still pounding, the exhaustion of everything, of this entire ordeal, crashing over me. It was over. For now. But I knew this fight would never truly be finished. Even as I stood there, gasping for breath, I could still feel the echo of the demon's presence lingering in the church. Her reach was long, and she would never truly release me. I had won the battle, but the war was never ending. As the last remnants of the demon's twisted form faded into the air, the silence in the church was deafening. The once oppressive atmosphere now felt oddly hollow, as if the very walls themselves were breathing a sigh of relief. But as I stood there, the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in. The demon had been vanquished, for now, at least, but something didn't feel right. The church felt different. The darkness that had been looming over me for so long didn't feel entirely gone. I could still feel its presence, like a heavy fog hanging just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to return. A terrible thought crept into my mind, one I had been trying to ignore for as long as I could. I wasn't free. Not truly. The demon had been destroyed, yes, but in doing so, I had unknowingly bound myself to her curse. The ancient texts, the rituals, the knowledge I had gained, they had all led to this moment. I had defeated her, but I had also become a part of her, tethered to the very thing I had tried to escape. You think you've won, but you have only made a choice. Her voice echoed in my mind, cold and unyielding. I spun around, but there was nothing there, no sign of her. She was gone, physically, but her words lingered like poison in my ears. In the distance, the church bell rang again, an eerie, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the same as before. It was softer, almost mournful, but still loud enough to send ripples of dread through my entire body. The price of your defiance will be paid in full. I understood then. The demon's power wasn't just about possession, it was about corruption. It had never been about a simple fight between life and death. She had made me a part of her world, even as I thought I was destroying hers. I was already lost. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The demon's curse had taken root inside me, deeper than I had ever imagined. I wasn't free. I could feel the dark seed she had planted, taking root in my soul. There was no escape from it now. It would consume me, just as it had consumed her. I had fought so hard, but in the end, I was the one who had been fooled. I collapsed onto the cold stone floor, my body trembling as the full weight of my actions pressed down on me. My mind raced, trying to find some other way, some loophole that could free me. But it was too late. The demon's hold on me was absolute. There is no escaping me, her voice whispered again, this time from within me, from somewhere deep in my own thoughts. You are mine, as I was once hers. The darkness that took me will now claim you. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. The answer was inescapable, as cruel as it was inevitable. I had to make a sacrifice, but not just any sacrifice. It wasn't enough to just sever the link between the demon and myself. No. The only way to end this, to truly end the cycle of torment, of fear, of unrelenting darkness, was to give up everything I had fought for, my freedom, my life, and my very soul. You cannot fight me, the demon said, her tone mocking, but beneath it, I could hear the faintest hint of fear. You think you can change your fate, but you cannot. You will never be free. She was right. My fate had already been sealed the moment I walked into this church. And now, I was the one who would decide how it would end. The ritual that had trapped me, that had bound my soul to hers, could only be undone by a final, irreversible sacrifice. I would have to give up the one thing that had kept me going, the will to live, to survive. I would have to offer myself up to the darkness completely, to become a vessel, a gate that would close forever. The demon would cease to exist, but I would cease to exist as well. My soul would be absorbed into the very place she had come from, and I would become one with the eternal darkness. It was the only way to ensure that the curse would not pass on to another, that the church would not claim more victims, that no one else would ever have to face the horrors I had lived through. But the decision wasn't easy. The thought of giving up everything, my future, my relationships, the small joys I had left, was unbearable. The weight of the sacrifice pressed down on me with a suffocating force. Could I really do this? Could I willingly give up everything I had fought so hard to keep? "You cannot escape me," the demon whispered again, and I realized she wasn't just speaking to me. She was speaking to all of us. The darkness was inside all of us. We all had to make the choice, sooner or later. With tears in my eyes and the last remnants of my resolve burning like a fragile flame, I made my choice. I stepped forward, my hands trembling, and began to chant the final incantation, the one that would end everything. As the words left my lips, the world seemed to collapse around me. The church, the darkness, the demon, they all faded into nothingness. I could feel the pull of the void, and for the first time, I understood what true silence felt like. And then, there was nothing. No more fear. No more darkness. No more church. No more demon. Only the void. The ultimate sacrifice. My end. The moment the final incantation left my lips, everything around me shattered. The church, the walls, the air, everything dissolved into an endless expanse of darkness. I felt myself being pulled into something far colder, far deeper than anything I had ever known. There was no sound, no movement, no sense of time, just an overwhelming void that swallowed me whole. The first thing I noticed was the absence of everything. My body, my senses, they were gone. There was no weight to my limbs, no breath in my chest, and yet I was still aware of my existence. It was a strange, alien feeling. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, nothing. I had become part of the darkness itself, like a shadow in the corners of the world, never fully realized, never fully gone. But then I saw it. A faint glimmer in the distance, a silhouette in the void. It was me, myself. I could see my own form, but it wasn't quite right. I wasn't alive anymore. I wasn't even human. My spirit, my soul, hung suspended in the inky blackness like a lost fragment of a shattered mirror. The figure that was once me was translucent, ethereal, fading at the edges, as if the very concept of my existence was being erased from the fabric of reality. I reached out instinctively, trying to grasp at something, anything. My hands, if they could even be called hands now, passed through the air like wisps of smoke, unable to touch anything. There was no sensation of solid matter, only the sensation of endless space, an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into the very core of my being. As I tried to make sense of what was happening, I felt it, her. The presence of the demon was palpable now, not just a lingering voice or shadow, but something far more invasive. Her essence surrounded me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper into this abyss. She was the one who had led me here, the one who had orchestrated this entire fate. I had thought I was the one in control, but I was wrong. All of it, the curse, the rituals, the bell, had been leading to this. I was her ultimate prize. "You belong to me now," the voice of the demon whispered, her voice not in my ears, but in the very fabric of my consciousness. It wasn't an echo. It was as though she was my thoughts, my fears, my desires. "This is where all souls like yours end. You were never meant to escape." Her words echoed through my spirit, and I felt an icy chill run through what remained of me. I had given everything to destroy her, to save others from her curse, but it had all been in vain. Now, I was nothing more than a shadow in her world, a part of her unholy kingdom. I could see other figures, just like mine, drifting aimlessly through the void. Each of them seemed to be trapped in their own despair, flickering like faint stars in an endless, lifeless sky. Were they all like me? Were they all souls who had tried and failed to escape her grasp? Or were they something else entirely? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was not alone. The darkness was full of us, the forgotten souls, the ones who had fallen victim to this curse. There is no escape, the demon's voice echoed again, this time louder, more assertive, as if it were the very law of the universe in this place. This is your eternity now. You are mine. Forever. Her presence began to grow stronger, and I felt it, the pull. The sensation of being dragged, slowly, inexorably, towards something. Was it her? Was it a new fate? Or was it simply the inevitable, the endless cycle of damnation? I didn't know. I looked around, trying to make sense of this world, but all that existed was the endless void and the creeping darkness that wrapped itself around me like a blanket, suffocating, all-consuming. My mind screamed, but no sound escaped. I could not move, could not fight. I was nothing more than a prisoner in a realm beyond life and death. And yet, as the pull of the darkness grew stronger, a small part of me, the part that had once been human, resisted. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want this to be my end. I wanted to scream, to shout, to break free. But I was powerless. The darkness took me further. I could feel it seep into my very essence, consuming me. I was fading, but not in the way I had expected. It wasn't just my body or my spirit. It was my identity. I was losing myself, becoming one with this dark abyss. And then, with the final tendrils of my existence slipping away, I realized one last, horrifying truth. I was no longer me. I was no longer a person, no longer a soul. I had become part of her, part of the curse, part of the demon. The last shred of my consciousness flickered out, and I was no more. The darkness had consumed me. Forever. Time lost all meaning in the endless void. There was no past, no future, only the present, a suffocating, oppressive weight that pressed down on my very soul. Or what was left of it. I had become less than a shadow, an echo of the person I once was, drifting in a place that could never be called home. I had thought my torment was the end. That my battle, my sacrifice, had freed me from the demon's grasp. But I was wrong. The truth was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. The very moment I had given my life to save myself and others, I had unknowingly sealed my fate. I had become part of the curse. Part of her. The realization hit me like a physical blow, making my ethereal form shudder with dread. The demon had not only claimed my soul, she had twisted it, woven it into the very fabric of her existence. I was no longer an individual. I was no longer a victim. I had become one of them, a part of the endless cycle, a piece of the darkness. I looked around, or at least, I tried to. My vision, or whatever passed for sight in this place, was clouded by a thick, oppressive blackness. But then, through the shadows, I saw them. Other souls, flickering like weak flames in the void, their forms as broken and fragmented as mine. I recognized some of them from the stories, the lost souls of those who had come before me. But I also saw something else. I saw her, the demon, or at least a reflection of her. Her presence lingered, not as an entity that controlled us from afar, but as a part of the very fabric of this dark place. She had not simply taken our lives. She had made us one with her. Her power, her essence, flowed through this dimension, and we were the vessels. The souls who had fallen to her curse were no longer separate. We were her. As the reality of it all sank in, I understood the truth of what had happened. I was not her victim. I had not fought her. I had not sacrificed myself to destroy her. No, in my final act of defiance, I had merely joined the ranks of those she had already claimed. The demon's laugh echoed in my mind, but I could no longer tell where the sound came from. It was everywhere. It was me. It was us. You are mine now, just as she was, the voice whispered again, but it was no longer a threat. It was a fact. A truth I could not escape. For a moment, a small flicker of defiance remained in my fading consciousness. I tried to recall the rituals, the attempts to fight back, the strength I had once possessed. But it was all futile. Every last ounce of my will was fading, dissipating into the void, as if I were a candle burning down to nothing. I looked again at the other souls, the ones who shared this fate with me. Some of them were like me, lost, broken, their essence shattered and scattered through this prison. Others seemed more whole, their forms darker, stronger, more permanent in the darkness. They were the ones who had been here longer, who had become one with the demon's power. They were the ones who had truly joined her. It was then that I realized what I had become. I had become a part of the curse, a part of the demon's eternal cycle. And I would remain here, in this hellish realm, for all of eternity, just as she had. There would be no redemption. There would be no escape. I was not just a victim of her dark magic. I had become a vessel, a new host for her dark powers, her evil will. And as I felt myself slip further into the abyss, I knew the truth. I was her next weapon. My existence, now a part of her twisted reality, would serve only one purpose: to lure the next soul into her grasp. I would be her tool, her agent of darkness, forever. The cycle would continue. I was her next victim, and in this darkness, I would remain. The sound of the bell tolling echoed in the silence of the void. I couldn't tell if it was a memory, a dream, or some twisted reflection of the past. It rang over and over, each chime more haunting than the last. And somehow, in this unending night, I knew the truth: the bell had never stopped ringing. It had always been a part of her, a part of the curse. And now, it was part of me, too. The church was a distant, fading memory, a place I could no longer truly see but could feel lingering in the depths of my mind. The walls, the pews, the shadows, everything that once made it so terrifying now seemed familiar. Too familiar. It was a prison that had become my home. And then I saw it. A mirror. The same one I had passed by during my first night in the church. At first, it was empty, just a reflection of the cold stone walls. But as the seconds passed, it began to change. My reflection appeared. But it wasn't me as I had once been. It was a twisted version, an image warped by the darkness, a shadow of what I had become. The reflection grinned at me, but I didn't. It was no longer my face that stared back at me, but the face of the demon herself. Her features were faint, flickering like a broken image, but they were unmistakable. My reflection was consumed by her, lost to her will. And as I looked deeper into the mirror, I could see others. The faces of the lost souls. I could see them, the ones who had fallen before me, staring back at me from within their reflective surface. They were all trapped in the same unending cycle, their eyes wide with fear, or perhaps with resignation. They were now part of the curse, part of the demon's eternal design. But it didn't stop there. As I stood there, paralyzed in horror, I began to hear the bell tolling again, louder this time. It vibrated through the very air around me, and with each chime, the darkness grew thicker, closing in like a suffocating fog. The bell rang at midnight, forever. The same bell that had once tolled in the church, signaling the presence of something terrible, was now an eternal part of the curse. It was not just the demon's doing, it was ours. My reflection in the mirror twisted again. I could see myself, standing in that very same church, in the same spot I had once been. But I wasn't alive anymore. I was a part of the bell, a shadow, a voice, a broken echo caught in the endless loop. My existence was now as much a part of the sound of the bell as the bell itself. I was the bell. My soul had been absorbed into the tolling, becoming part of the unceasing midnight that haunted the church. Every time the bell rang, it was my voice, my essence, reverberating through the night, calling out to those who dared to listen. But I could never speak. I could never reach them. I could only watch as they too were drawn into the curse, their lives claimed by the same darkness that had consumed me. The shadows in the church shifted, stretching and crawling like living things. They were alive with memories, with the ghosts of the past, and they moved with purpose, knowing their time was coming. And all the while, the bell tolled, over and over, never ceasing. Always midnight. I looked once more into the mirror and saw myself there, no longer a person, but part of the void, part of the darkness. I had become what I had feared. A prisoner of the curse, of the demon, forever bound to the bell. And in the distance, I heard the sound of footsteps, footsteps of the next soul. One that would wander into the church, drawn by the tolling bell. Another lost soul, ready to become a part of the endless cycle. The bell rang again. It would never stop. Not for me. Not for anyone. And as I stared into the mirror, into the shadows of eternity, I understood the final, terrible truth. The curse had no end. I was the bell. And the midnight would always return. The creature in the basement. Have you ever moved into a place and felt an instant sense of unease? A quiet, creeping feeling that something is off? I thought moving to this new apartment would be a fresh start. After months of searching, I'd finally found a place that fit my budget. A quaint, slightly worn-down building on the outskirts of town. Not exactly luxury, but it had its charm, and I liked the idea of having fewer neighbors around. More privacy, I told myself. But from the very first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone here. The basement was the first thing that unnerved me. My apartment was one floor above it, and though the door to the basement was always locked, strange sounds drifted up through the floor at odd hours. Sometimes it was the distant clanking of pipes, but every now and then it sounded almost like footsteps. When I asked the landlord, he brushed it off, saying the plumbing in the building was old. He promised I'd get used to it in no time. Just the charm of the place, he chuckled, a little too easily. But the noises were more than just plumbing. They felt deliberate, purposeful, like something was pacing down there. The neighbors didn't seem bothered. The few people I met only shrugged when I brought it up. It's an old building. Everything creaks, they'd say. And I tried to believe them, tried to ignore that prickling sensation at the back of my neck every time I heard a strange sound. But the noise continued, and with each passing day, it became harder to dismiss. One night, I heard it clearly, a scratching sound, low and persistent, coming from directly beneath my apartment. It lasted for what felt like hours. My heart raced as I lay there in the dark, listening to whatever was moving just below me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, maybe a stray animal that had found its way into the basement. Raccoons, I reasoned. Or maybe even rats. City living came with its share of nuisances, after all. But the scratching was too deliberate, too steady. It was like someone, or something, was trying to get out. The next morning, I went down to inspect the basement door. It was locked, as always, and I didn't have a key. The landlord had been clear that tenants weren't supposed to go down there, said it was only for maintenance purposes. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, I wished I'd pushed harder. What was really down there? That night, I tried to distract myself by keeping the TV on, drowning out the faint noises below. But around midnight, I heard it again, louder this time. The same scratching, punctuated by what sounded like deep, shuffling footsteps. They moved slowly, deliberately, right beneath me. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my chest. I crept out of bed and knelt by the floor, straining to hear. The scratching turned into a low, guttural groan, almost as if it was calling for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence filled the apartment, thick and heavy. I sat there in the dark, heart racing, straining to hear anything that would tell me I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But nothing came. I barely slept that night. The next day, exhaustion settled over me like a fog. I spent the morning trying to shake off the fear that had gripped me all night. Surely there was a logical explanation for the sounds. I told myself that over and over, hoping that repeating it would make it true. Still, my curiosity nagged at me, growing stronger with each unexplained noise. That evening, I decided to ask one of my neighbors again, hoping they might know something more. Mrs. Calloway, an elderly woman who'd lived in the building for decades, was coming up the stairs just as I left my apartment. She stopped when she saw me, giving me a wary look. "Good evening, Mrs. Calloway," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't mean to bother you, but have you ever heard anything strange coming from the basement?" Her face stiffened, eyes darting around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "The basement's locked for a reason," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "Best to leave it alone." But I hesitated. The noises, they're hard to ignore. It sounds like someone, or something, is moving around down there. Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, leaning in until her voice was barely audible. "You're new here, so let me give you some advice," she murmured. "Ignore it. Don't go poking around where you don't belong. The last tenant who did, well, he didn't stay here very long after that." I swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down my spine. "What happened to him?" She glanced away, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He left in the middle of the night," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Never came back. That's all I know." With that, she turned and shuffled up the stairs, leaving me standing there, more unsettled than ever. Her warning echoed in my mind as I returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me and double-checking the latch. That night, the sounds from the basement returned, louder and more insistent than before. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the scratching and groaning coming from below. It was as if whatever was down there knew I was alone, as if it was calling to me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The sounds had burrowed into my mind, lingering even during the day, haunting me like a bad dream I couldn't shake. The scratching, the shuffling footsteps, the low groans, they were no longer just noises. They felt like a message, a call that I was somehow supposed to answer. On the fourth night, I decided I would go down there. I needed to see what was causing this, or maybe I just needed proof that it was all in my head. I grabbed a flashlight, steeling myself as I approached the door to the basement. As I turned the knob, I half expected it to be locked. But to my surprise, it clicked open. The landlord's warning echoed in my mind, and I hesitated, feeling my heart pound in my chest. But curiosity won out over caution, and I pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges sounding far too loud in the empty hallway. The air inside was cold and stale, with a faint, earthy smell that reminded me of damp soil. I shined my flashlight down the stairs, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a set of narrow, steep steps descending into a pit of shadow. Each step I took felt like crossing an invisible line, pulling me deeper into something I didn't understand, something I probably had no business meddling with. When I reached the bottom, the beam of my flashlight fell on the cold, cement floor. The room was small and cluttered with old, abandoned furniture and dusty cardboard boxes. At first, it seemed harmless, like an ordinary storage room. I could almost laugh at myself for being so paranoid until I heard the faint sound of breathing. I froze, straining my ears. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft, raspy breath coming from somewhere deeper in the shadows. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, a cold sweat breaking out along my skin. I pointed the flashlight towards the far corner of the room, the beam revealing the shapes of scattered objects and empty shelves. And then, something moved. It was subtle, a faint shift in the darkness, but I saw it, a hunched figure, crouched low, barely visible in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat, my breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look human, the limbs were too long, the posture too twisted. It stayed perfectly still, as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. My mind raced, my body frozen as I stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was a trick of the light, an illusion conjured by my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew this was real. The creature seemed to notice me. Slowly, it began to unfold itself from the shadows, rising to its full height. The shape of it was impossible to comprehend, limbs bent at unnatural angles, skin pale and taut, stretched over what looked like sharp, bony protrusions. Its face was hidden, shrouded in darkness, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, cold and unwavering. For a moment, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then, without warning, it took a step forward. The sudden movement snapped me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, heart racing, my mind screaming at me to get out. The creature took another step, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach twist with dread. I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs, nearly tripping in my desperation to escape. I could hear it behind me, the faint scrape of its claws on the concrete floor, the low, guttural sound of its breathing echoing up the stairwell. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, locking it, my chest heaving as I backed away, half expecting it to burst through. For a few agonizing moments, there was silence. Then, the scratching began again, louder this time, relentless. I backed away from the basement door, my heart racing so hard it felt like it would burst. The scratching continued, sharp and insistent, like claws raking against the wood. Each scrape seemed to vibrate through the floor, echoing in my bones, filling the entire apartment with an unbearable sense of dread. I locked myself in my bedroom, trying to calm my breathing, telling myself that whatever was in the basement couldn't possibly get past the door. But deep down, I didn't believe it. There was a raw, primal terror that gnawed at me, an instinct screaming that no locked door would be enough to keep that thing away. Hours passed, though I didn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow seemed like a threat. I watched the clock tick by, counting down the minutes until morning, hoping daylight would somehow break the spell of this nightmare. When dawn finally arrived, I forced myself to leave the apartment. The scratching had stopped just before sunrise, but the silence it left behind felt even heavier. I went straight to the landlord's office, demanding to know what was in the basement. He looked at me with a weary expression, as if he had this conversation too many times before. "You went down there, didn't you?" he asked, his voice resigned. I nodded, unable to form the right words. The memory of that thing in the darkness was too fresh, too vivid. The landlord sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're not the first tenant to ask about the basement," he admitted quietly. "Most people, they don't last long after they see what's down there." "What is it?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is living down there?" He looked away, his gaze distant. "I don't know exactly," he confessed. "Something old. Something that was here long before this building was even built. I've tried to keep it locked away, to keep it contained, but..." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "Sometimes, it calls to people. Once you hear it, once you see it, it doesn't let you go." His words sent a chill down my spine. I felt a wave of anger and fear, mixed with helplessness. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Just live with it?" He looked at me with a sad, almost pitying expression. "Some tenants move out. Others, well, they stay. But no one ever forgets." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The only thing I can tell you is, don't go back down there. Ignore the sounds. Pretend you never saw it. It's the only way to keep your sanity." I left the office, feeling dazed, his words circling in my mind. Pretend I never saw it? How could I possibly pretend that thing wasn't there, lurking just below my feet? But I didn't see any other choice. I couldn't afford to move out, and if the landlord was right, then acknowledging it, confronting it again, would only make things worse. That night, I lay in bed, trying to ignore every creak, every distant thud, every faint scratch that echoed up through the floorboards. I closed my eyes, repeating to myself that it was just an old building, just plumbing and settling noises. I clung to that thought like a lifeline, willing myself to believe it. But the creature wasn't finished with me. Around midnight, I heard the scratching again, sharper than before, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blanket over my head, trying to block out the sound. But then, there was a new noise, a low, rasping whisper, coming from somewhere deep in the darkness below. It was saying my name. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs as that raspy whisper drifted up through the floor. My name. It was unmistakable, slow and drawn out, like a breath forced through cracked lips. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind, strung out from lack of sleep and fear, was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, clearer, more insistent, scraping through the silence like nails on glass. I lay there, paralyzed, clinging to my blanket, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect me from whatever was down there. "Come down," it murmured, the voice like a sigh, echoing through the stillness. "Come down and see." My mouth went dry, every instinct telling me to stay put, to stay as far away from that basement as possible. But something in that voice, something cold and invasive, wormed its way into my thoughts, tugging at me, pulling me toward the edge of the bed. It was like the whisper had a hold on me, reaching into the deepest part of my mind, unraveling my will. I fought it, squeezing my eyes shut, clutching the edges of the mattress, trying to drown it out. But the whisper persisted, sliding through my thoughts, pressing against my defenses. The sound became louder, more insistent, each word vibrating through me until I felt like I was coming apart. Finally, as if in a trance, I got out of bed. My body moved on its own, one step at a time, guiding me toward the door. I didn't want to go, didn't want to face whatever waited for me in that darkness, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for the doorknob, twisted it, and before I knew it, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the basement door. It was ajar, open just a crack. I could see a sliver of darkness beyond, stretching down into the depths, beckoning me. The whisper grew stronger, more urgent, filling my mind with an overwhelming sense of dread and inevitability. "Come down, see me." My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pushing it open. The darkness seemed to expand, swallowing up the light from the hallway, pulling me deeper, closer. I took a step forward, my feet sinking into the silence, my heart hammering as I descended the stairs. The air grew colder, thicker, almost suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The basement looked different this time, darker, the walls looming closer, as if they were closing in around me. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, I saw it. The creature was waiting, crouched in the shadows, its twisted limbs splayed out like the roots of a dying tree. Its eyes, hollow, empty sockets, stared at me with a cold, penetrating gaze, as if it could see right through me. The skin stretched tight over its bones was pale and mottled, covered in strange, dark patches that pulsed and writhed, as if something inside it was alive. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped under that terrible, unblinking stare. The creature tilted its head, and its mouth, a dark, jagged line, twisted into something that resembled a smile. It spoke again, that same whisper, but this time it wasn't calling my name. It was laughing, a low, guttural sound that crawled under my skin, filling me with a suffocating sense of horror. And then, slowly, it reached out one of its gnarled, bony hands, the fingers impossibly long, curling toward me in a silent, horrifying invitation. I stumbled backward, snapping out of my trance, my heart pounding as I turned and fled up the stairs. The creature's laughter followed me, echoing up the stairwell, chasing me back into the light. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The laughter continued, muffled but relentless, seeping through the floorboards, filling every corner of my apartment, every darkened room. I could still hear it, that whisper, taunting, relentless, as if it had carved itself into my mind, a stain that couldn't be washed away. And as I sat there, huddled in the corner, trying to block out the sound, a horrible realization settled over me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, that creature would always be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me. I had opened the door. And now, it would never let me go. The days that followed felt like a fever dream. I tried to pretend everything was normal, to live my life as if I hadn't seen what was in the basement, as if that encounter hadn't cracked something open inside me. But the creature's presence clung to me, an invisible shadow that seeped into every moment, every breath. The laughter haunted my nights. I'd lie awake, hearing it faintly beneath the floorboards, that low, guttural sound that seemed to mock my fear, growing louder with each passing hour. I tried to drown it out with music, with TV, with anything that could distract me, but it was no use. The creature was always there, waiting, whispering, calling. By the end of the week, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept in days, and my reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger's, hollow-eyed, gaunt, haunted. I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone. Friends called, left messages, but I ignored them all. How could I explain any of this to someone else? How could I make them understand that the horror I felt was real? One evening, as I sat in the living room, exhausted and on edge, I heard a familiar sound. The scratching. It was louder than ever, clawing up from the basement with a new urgency. And then came the whisper, clearer than it had ever been. "Come down, just one more time." I shook my head, trying to block it out, but the voice pressed on, digging into my mind like a relentless parasite. "Just once more, come down, and it will all end." A cold dread washed over me. I knew I shouldn't listen, knew that going back down there was the last thing I should do. But the pull was stronger than ever, tugging at something deep inside me, filling me with a twisted hope that maybe, somehow, I could end this. Maybe if I went down there one more time, I could face it, confront it, and be free. I stood up, feeling numb, and made my way to the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but the whisper urged me on, promising an end to the terror, to the sleepless nights, to the laughter that clawed at my sanity. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, descending the stairs for what I told myself would be the last time. The basement was darker than I remembered, the air thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. My flashlight flickered as I reached the bottom, the beam barely illuminating the corners of the room. But this time, I didn't need light to know where it was. The creature was waiting, crouched in the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on me, unblinking, hungry. A sickening grin spread across its face as it straightened, unfolding its limbs with a slow, deliberate motion as if savoring the moment. "You came back," it whispered, its voice slithering through the darkness, wrapping around me like a cold, invisible hand. "I knew you would." I took a step back, but my feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, rooted in place. The creature took a step forward, its twisted form looming closer, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "What do you want from me?" I choked out, my voice barely more than a whisper. The creature tilted its head, and its smile widened, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. "You opened the door," it murmured. "Now, you belong to me." Before I could react, it lunged, closing the distance between us in an instant. Cold, bony fingers wrapped around my wrists, pulling me closer, dragging me into the darkness. I struggled, tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as its hollow eyes bore into mine, filling my mind with a void so deep and empty that I felt myself slipping, falling into it, piece by piece. The last thing I remember is the creature's face, that twisted smile, as everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor, drenched in a cold sweat. The basement door was closed, and the room was silent, but something was wrong. My body felt heavy, strange, like I was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. I reached up, touching my face, my skin, but it didn't feel like mine. It was cold, rough, almost hollow. I stumbled to the mirror, barely recognizing the figure staring back at me. The eyes were mine, but the face, the body, it was twisted, distorted, stretched over sharp, bony protrusions that hadn't been there before. And then, In the silence, I heard it, the laughter. But this time, it was coming from inside me, echoing through my mind, filling every corner of my soul. I realized, in that terrible, final moment, that I hadn't escaped the creature. I was the creature. In the days that followed, I wandered through my apartment in a haze, wrestling with the horrific reality of what I'd become. Every mirror, every reflective surface showed me a twisted, distorted image, my body transformed, my eyes hollow and dark, my skin stretched tight like it barely held together. I was trapped in this thing's form, bound to its terrible, unnatural existence. I tried everything to reverse it. I screamed, begged, tore at my skin as if I could peel away this grotesque shell and reveal the person I'd been before. But nothing worked. Each attempt only made me feel the creature's laughter more deeply, an insidious presence inside me that fed on my terror, growing stronger with each passing day. My apartment became my prison. I couldn't leave. What would people think if they saw this monstrous figure stepping out of my door? And I couldn't let anyone in, couldn't risk them seeing what I had become, couldn't bear to explain the unexplainable. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from friends and family, each one a painful reminder of the life I'd left behind, of the person I no longer was. One night, as I lay curled up on the floor, a new horror settled over me. I realized that I was no longer alone, even in my own mind. I could feel the creature lurking inside me, a separate presence, whispering in the corners of my thoughts, tainting my memories, warping my reality. It spoke to me, urging me to open the basement door again, to let it take full control. I could feel it waiting, biding its time, like a predator stalking prey. And worst of all, I felt the faint, twisted urge to obey. The days blurred together, each one more unbearable than the last. I was losing myself, slipping away, becoming something else entirely. Each time I looked in the mirror, my reflection felt more foreign, as if my own face was being erased, replaced by that grinning, hollow-eyed horror. The creature's whispers grew louder, stronger, drowning out my own thoughts. It told me stories, dark, twisted things about the basement, about all the others who had been drawn to it, who had heard its call and never returned. One night, in a final, desperate act, I went back to the basement door, gripping the handle with shaking hands. Maybe if I confronted it again, if I faced it in the darkness, I could break free. I could take back my life. But as I turned the handle and stepped inside, I realized the truth. The basement was no longer a place beneath my feet, a room in this building. The basement was inside me, a void that would grow and consume until nothing was left of who I had once been. The creature had won. It had taken me, just as it had taken countless others, and now I was merely a hollow shell, a vessel for its endless, insatiable hunger. As I looked into the shadows, the last remnants of myself slipping away, I heard its laughter echo through me, filling every corner of my mind. And in that final, terrible moment, I realized that the creature wasn't finished. It was only waiting, biding its time, whispering to the next soul who would open that door, who would hear its call and take my place in the darkness. The days dragged on, but my perception of time had warped into something unrecognizable. The lines between reality and the whispers blurred. I no longer trusted my own thoughts, my own reflection. The creature inside me had become a constant companion, always present, always watching from the edges of my consciousness, its cold, predatory gaze never leaving me. I stopped leaving my apartment entirely. The outside world felt foreign, terrifying, like a place I no longer belonged. The streets were full of strangers who couldn't see the monster I had become. Even the familiar faces in my memories seemed distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. My family, my friends, they were like ghosts, fading into the fog of my past. I didn't know if they were still trying to reach out to me, if they even cared, but I didn't dare answer. They wouldn't recognize me now. No one would. The creature inside me no longer whispered, it roared. Its presence was all-encompassing, pulling my thoughts away, filling me with an insatiable hunger that had nothing to do with food. It wanted more. It wanted everything. I could feel its claws twisting through my mind, like icy tendrils, leaving behind an ever-deepening darkness. And then, one night, it made its move. I had been lying on the floor again, unable to sleep, unable to escape the suffocating stillness of the apartment. The whispers had been constant, a hum beneath everything, until suddenly they stopped. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. And then, a voice. Not my own. Not the creature's voice either, but something else, a new voice, one that was sharp and clear and human. Help me. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. The voice was faint, but it carried an unmistakable sense of terror. It sounded distant, coming from far below me, but I knew, somehow, I knew it was coming from the basement. The creature's lair. I pushed myself up from the floor, my body moving on its own, each step taking me closer to that cursed door. My hand reached for the handle, but before I could turn it, the creature's voice filled my mind, a sudden, violent roar that shattered my thoughts. And oh, it screamed. You don't need to help them. You belong to me. You are me. But the human voice was stronger now, desperate, pleading. Please, you don't have to be alone. Please, help us. I stood there, my hand on the door, my heart hammering in my chest. There was something familiar about that voice. Something that reached through the chaos and the darkness, pulling at the last remnants of my humanity. The creature raged within me, its claws scraping against the inside of my mind, trying to drown out the voice, trying to force me back into the shadowed abyss of its will. But the human voice, the pleading, terrified voice, cut through it all. You're not like them. You're not one of them. Please, help. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something stir inside me, something long buried beneath the creature's relentless control. A glimmer of something human. Something me. I opened the door. The basement was darker than before, the air thick and suffocating, like the weight of an ancient curse pressing down on me. The whispers, the laughter, everything was gone. The space was empty, silent. But the voice, it was still there, faint and distant, coming from the farthest corner of the room. I stepped into the basement, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The shadows seemed to press in on me, closing in from every angle. And then, in the farthest corner, I saw it. There were others. Figures, hunched and twisted, their bodies misshapen and contorted, their eyes wide and empty, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. They were trapped, just as I had been, just as I was. But unlike me, they hadn't become the creature. Not yet. Their voices filled the air now, a chorus of whispers, begging for release, for someone to save them. I realized then that the creature's curse didn't stop with me. It had claimed them too, and now they were nothing more than hollow shells, twisted reflections of the people they had once been. They had opened the door, just like I had. They had come down into the darkness, thinking they could escape, thinking they could survive. But there was no escaping this thing. And then I understood. I wasn't just a victim. I had become the creature. The creature had never been something external to me. It was inside me, feeding off my fear, my isolation, my desperation. And now, it had changed me, shaped me into something else entirely. I felt its grip tightening within me, its laughter roaring in my mind, suffocating my thoughts. It wanted me to join them, to become like them, just another twisted, mindless thing wandering the basement. And yet, part of me fought it. Part of me fought to hold on to whatever was left of who I had been. But the creature was too strong. The hunger, the desire to consume, to pull everything into its darkness, it was too powerful. As I took a step toward them, the last remnants of myself dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the creature's will, its hunger, its insatiable need for more. I felt my body contort, my mind shatter, and then I was one of them, another hollow figure in the dark, forever trapped in the basement. And as I joined them, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The creature was always waiting. It was inside us all. The silence in the basement was deafening, broken only by the soft, muffled sobs of the figures around me. They had been here longer than I could comprehend, lost to time and the creature's influence, forever trapped in its grip. And now, as I joined them, I could feel it. The creature's essence, its will, pulsing through me, consuming what was left of my humanity, dragging me deeper into the dark. It was as if I had become part of something ancient, something far older than the walls of this building. The hunger, the need to feed, to twist, to consume, was no longer foreign to me. It was a part of me. It was me. The others in the basement stirred, their hollow eyes shifting toward me as I approached. They had been waiting for someone like me, someone who would open the door, someone who would fall, just as they had. They had long given up hope of ever escaping, long resigned to the fact that they were nothing more than echoes of their former selves. But in that moment, I realized with sickening clarity that they weren't just victims. They were the remnants of those who had been consumed by the creature's will. And now, I could feel it. The creature was not just feeding off me, it was teaching me. It was showing me the path forward, guiding my movements, shaping my thoughts. The hunger was no longer a force to fight. It was a force to embrace. I looked up at the door, now far above me. I could still see the faint outline of light through the cracks. And yet, I knew, somewhere deep within, that I could never leave. The door had been the beginning of this nightmare. But it was also the end. As I stood there, surrounded by the twisted figures of those who had fallen before me, I realized that the basement wasn't just a physical place. It was a state of mind, a never-ending abyss where the creature fed off fear, feeding on the isolation, on the loneliness that had drawn us all here in the first place. The hunger wasn't just for flesh. It was for the soul. I wanted to scream for my lost life, for the person I used to be, for the people I used to know. But I couldn't. The scream never came. Instead, I felt something inside me snap, like a rope breaking under too much strain. The last of my resistance, the last of my memories, faded into nothing. The creature inside me laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound, full of satisfaction. It was the laughter of something ancient and powerful, something that had seen countless souls slip into its grasp, seen them all become part of its darkness. And then I realized it wasn't just the basement that had been consuming us. The creature was the embodiment of isolation itself, of loneliness, of fear. It preyed on those who were lost, who had nowhere else to turn. It thrived on our weakest moments, when we felt most vulnerable. But the worst part was that I understood now. The creature wasn't just waiting for the next victim. It wasn't just waiting for the next person to open the door. It was waiting for me. As the twisted figures surrounded me, their eyes now empty of hope, their faces mirrors of my own despair, I felt the terrible truth settle in. I had become the creature's new door. And now, every time someone else opened that basement door, they wouldn't just find darkness. They would find me. As the basement grew darker, my sense of self, the last fragments of who I was, continued to crumble. I could feel the emptiness of the others around me. The twisted, hollow figures moved with eerie synchronicity, their eyes now dark voids, reflecting nothing but the cruel whispers of the creature that had consumed us all. There was no escape, no salvation. I tried to reach for something, anything, that would remind me of the world I had once known. But there was nothing. The basement, the creature, the abyss, they were all the same. The creature's influence seeped into every corner, every shadow, erasing all that was good and pure in me. And in that terrible moment, I understood the true nature of what I had become. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I had become the prison, the doorway, the trap. The creature whispered in my mind, its voice now a constant, like a low hum beneath everything else, demanding my obedience. It was teaching me, shaping me into something else. I could feel its power growing within me, feeding off the fear, the hopelessness, the despair of all those who came before me, and all those who would follow. I had become a part of its endless cycle, its eternal hunt. And now, every time the basement door opened, a new soul would step into the darkness, ready to be consumed. And they would find me there, waiting for them, a reflection of their own fear, their own despair. I couldn't fight it anymore. The hunger inside me, the hunger to feed, to pull others into the depths, was too overwhelming. It was all I could feel now. I was a part of the creature's will, just another puppet in its twisted game. But then I heard it. A voice. Familiar. Weak. Please. The voice was faint, barely a whisper. But I knew who it was. It was the same voice I had heard before. The one calling out from the basement. Help me. I looked around, my eyes wide, the hunger rising within me as the others stared at me with hollow eyes. They were waiting for me to lead the way, to open the door once more. But I didn't move. The creature's laughter echoed in my mind, mocking me, trying to force me to take the next step. But I felt something stir deep within me. A flicker of recognition. A memory. The voice. It was familiar. It was mine. I turned toward the door, the one I had sealed off long ago. The creature's grip tightened around me, trying to stop me, but I ignored it. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. For the first time, I felt a flicker of defiance. I was the doorway now, and I was going to decide who would step through it next. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal handle. The basement was silent now, all those twisted figures watching me with dead eyes, their empty gazes fixed on my every move. The voice still echoed in my head, growing louder with each passing second. Help me. But the creature's grip on my mind was too powerful. It was laughing again, its voice low and dark, a constant undercurrent of dread that pulsed through my very being. You cannot fight me. You are mine. You will always be mine. It was right. I had become its prisoner. The hunger inside me was so overwhelming, so consuming, that I felt it gnawing at the very core of who I was. It was as if I were being torn apart from the inside out, my memories fading, my will crumbling. The door, the one I had once feared, now seemed like the only escape. And yet, I hesitated. I remembered. I remembered what it felt like before, when I was me. When I had a life outside this basement. I remembered the warmth of the sun, the sound of laughter, the taste of food, simple things, but things that felt so far away now. You are no longer that person, the creature whispered in my mind. You are part of me. You will always be part of me. But there was still something in me, something deep down, buried beneath the weight of the creature's will that refused to give in completely. It wasn't much. Just a faint glimmer of resistance, a fragile thread holding me to the remnants of my former self. I turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, the cold air of the basement rushing past me, as if the darkness itself were exhaling, waiting for me to step through. I didn't move. The creature's laughter grew louder, more insistent, trying to drown out the quiet voice that was still there, hidden deep within me. Don't do it, it whispered. You know what will happen. You know what will follow. You are the doorway now. You are the one who will trap others. You will bring them here. You will make them like us. I took a deep breath. It wasn't the air of freedom I once longed for. It was the suffocating cold of the void, the breath of the creature itself. But something inside me still fought to hold on to what I had been. With a final, trembling step, I crossed the threshold. The basement door slammed shut behind me. I had entered the darkness, and now I was part of it. But as the shadows closed in around me, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The hunger, the overwhelming, insatiable hunger, it wasn't just within me. It was everywhere. It had consumed everything, and now there was no turning back. The others, the ones who had been here longer than me, watched in silence. They had given up, long ago. They were just empty shells now, nothing more than echoes of their former selves. But I was different. I could still feel the faint remnants of what I had been. And that was worse. It was worse because I knew what was coming next. I would be the next one to open the door. I would be the one to let them in. The next victim would hear the whispers, feel the pull of the creature's hunger, and they would come. They would enter the basement, just like I had. And I would be there to greet them. I would be the one to trap them. And then, when they opened the door for the next one, it would be my face they saw. My eyes, empty and hollow, reflecting the same fear, the same hopelessness they had once felt. And that was the final truth I realized. There was no escape. The creature would never let go. I wasn't just part of its hunger anymore. I was its hunger. Forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.